The crystal chandelier in the Baton Rouge Country Club vibrated overhead, scattering fractured light across 500 silk-clad shoulders. My sister Camille stood center stage, tapping a manicured fingernail against the microphone. The sharp thud echoed over the clinking champagne flutes. I want to thank my parents for finally finding a real businessman to join the family in my husband Jace, she cooed to the crowd. She leaned into the mic, her gaze finding me in the shadows near the ice sculpture. And a toast to my older sister Eden for trying her best with her little consulting gig. Laughter rippled through the ballroom, a wave of high society condescension. My heart did not speed up. My hands remained steady. I took a slow sip of sparkling water, feeling the cold condensation against my palm. I navigated the sea of taffeta and tailored suits until I stood beside Jace. His tuxedo smelled like expensive cologne and unearned confidence. I slid a sealed, heavy cream envelope into his breast pocket. "A wedding gift," I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed forward. It was a $40 million notice of default. Before I tell you how I turned my own sister into a trespasser at her own wedding reception, do me a favor. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your own family, drop your age in the comments and let me know you are listening here on the Amanda Told Stories channel. We need to stick together. To understand the cold mathematics of my revenge, we have to rewind 6 months to the day my family drew the battle lines. The air in the French Quarter courtyard felt like breathing through a hot, wet towel. Louisiana humidity has a way of pressing the oxygen right out of your lungs, but that afternoon, the suffocating weight came from the empty folding chairs in the front row. My wedding day. The string quartet played a soft, haunting melody that only highlighted the silence of the people who were supposed to be there. Declan squeezed my fingers. His thumb brushed the lace of my sleeve. His eyes were dark, a silent offer to burn the whole day down if I asked. "We can just walk away, Eden," he murmured. "Just us." I stared at the 2 empty seats, reserved for my parents Charles and Vivian. The white rose petals scattered near their places were already bruising in the heat. They were not stuck in traffic. They were not delayed by a flight. They had boarded a private jet to Maui 3 days prior for Camille's extravagant 3-week pre-wedding yachting month. When my mother called the night before to confirm they were skipping my ceremony, she did not apologize. She sounded annoyed by the inconvenience of my milestone. "It is just a trivial courthouse-style affair, Eden," she had sighed over the phone, ice clinking in her glass. "Do not make a fuss. We need to focus on the real event next month." I did not cry. Crying requires a belief that the people hurting you actually care about your tears. I looked at Declan, saw the fierce loyalty anchored in his jaw, and I nodded toward the altar. "We marry today," I said, my voice quiet but forged in steel. We said our vows to an audience of friends and empty spaces. But the final fracture did not happen at the altar. It happened 3 hours later during our modest reception. My phone buzzed on the linen tablecloth. A notification cut through the ambient chatter. Camille had posted a photo. It showed my parents on the deck of a catamaran raising crystal glasses against a Hawaiian sunset. The caption read, "Family First." I locked the screen. The sting in my chest hardened into something sharp and cold. I did not know it yet, but they had not just skipped my wedding. They had fired the first shot in a war that would end with me dismantling their entire empire brick by brick. 3 weeks stretched into a deafening silence. 21 days of unanswered text messages and ignored phone calls followed my wedding. My parents did not send a card. They did not send a gift. The only proof they still existed came through Camille posting endless streams of pristine Hawaiian beaches and luxury yacht charters. I threw myself into my work at the family firm, burying the sting under maritime logistics reports and freight schedules. Then came the text from my mother Vivian. It arrived on a Tuesday evening, short and stripped of any warmth. Mandatory dinner, tomorrow at 7. Do not be late. The drive to the Baton Rouge estate felt like navigating a humid tunnel. The setting sun cast long, bruised shadows across the highway. Declan kept his hand resting on my knee, his thumb tracing a slow, grounding rhythm against the fabric of my dress. He understood the terrain we were entering. The Barbier estate sat behind towering wrought iron gates, a sprawling plantation-style mansion flanked by ancient live oaks dripping with Spanish moss. It was a monument to old Southern money and hidden resentments. We parked on the circular gravel driveway. The heavy oak front door swung open before we even reached the top step. The dining room smelled of roasted lamb and rosemary, and the sharp, metallic tang of impending conflict. Crystal wine glasses caught the light from the chandelier. The table was set for 6. I expected to find my father Charles sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, holding court as he always did. Instead, that seat was occupied by Camille. She wore a silk slip dress, her skin bronzed from the Pacific sun. She did not stand to greet us. She just raised her left hand, letting the dining room lights catch the staggering diamond on her ring finger. The stone was the size of a quail egg, blinding and ostentatious. Jace stood near the antique bar card in the corner. Before Hawaii, Jace wore off-the-rack suits and tried too hard to impress anyone with a checking account. Tonight, he wore bespoke linen. He did not ask my father for permission before reaching for the private reserve single malt scotch. He poured 2 fingers into a crystal tumbler, swirled the amber liquid, and offered me a slick, practiced grin. He looked like a man who had just stolen a winning lottery ticket and already cashed it. I took my seat across from my mother. Declan sat beside me, a quiet fortress of support. Vivian offered a tight, polite smile that did not reach her eyes. Charles focused on his plate, cutting his meat with precise, rigid motions. So I started keeping my voice even and professional. When are we looking at venues for the big day? You have been gone nearly a month. The planning must be falling behind. Camille let out a soft, melodic laugh. She exchanged a knowing glance with Jace, who walked over and placed a hand on her bare shoulder. "We married yesterday," Camille announced. The words hung in the air, heavy and thick. I stared at her, processing the timeline. The entire Hawaiian trip was not a pre-wedding celebration. It was a $1 million destination elopement. My parents had skipped my actual wedding day just to attend the opening week of Camille's extravagant honeymoon. They spent 20 days drinking champagne on the Pacific, culminating in a ceremony they deemed worthy of their presence. I felt Declan shift in his chair, the anger rolling off him in quiet waves. I placed my hand over his, squeezing once. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. "Well," I said, my tone chillingly flat. "Congratulations." Vivian cleared her throat. She wiped her mouth with a linen napkin and leaned forward. The performance was about to begin. "Eden, darling," Vivian murmured, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Your sister deserves a proper celebration here at home. A reception for our friends, the country club board, the industry partners. We are planning a local gala for 500 guests next month." I nodded slowly, waiting for the trap to snap shut. "That sounds like quite the undertaking." Vivian reached into her designer clutch resting on the table. She pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope and slid it across the polished mahogany. It stopped inches from my plate. It was a catering and venue invoice. The total at the bottom of the page was breathtaking. "Hawaii was incredibly expensive," Charles interjected, finally looking up from his meal. "We drained a significant portion of our liquid assets to give Camille the intimate ceremony she dreamed of. We are cash poor until the next quarter." Vivian tapped a manicured fingernail against the table. "We need you to step up as the older sister, Eden. You have that hefty savings account." Declan makes a fine living. We expect you to cover the costs of the local reception. It is your duty to this family." The audacity hit me like a physical blow. They abandoned my wedding, mocked my choices, funded a lavish tropical elopement for their golden child, and now expected me to empty my bank accounts to pay for her 500-guest party? I looked at Jace. He was sipping my father's scotch, watching me with a smug expression, fully expecting me to fold. For my entire life, I had played the role of the compliant, responsible daughter. I spent my 20s working 80-hour weeks building the digital supply chain infrastructure for Barbier Maritime Logistics, while Charles played 18 holes a day and Camille shopped in Paris. They assumed my loyalty was a bottomless well. I picked up the invoice. The paper was heavy embossed with gold foil. I folded it perfectly in half, then in half again, and placed it under the leg of my water glass to stop a slight wobble in the table. "No," I said. The single syllable echoed through the large room. The celebratory atmosphere shattered, replaced by a toxic, suffocating silence. "Excuse me?" Vivian gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "I will not give you a single dime," I said, maintaining steady eye contact with my mother. "You chose to fund a vacation instead of attending my wedding. You made your financial bed, you can sleep in it." Charles dropped his silverware. The clatter rang out like a gunshot. "You ungrateful brat," he snapped, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson. "This is about family legacy. It is about presenting a united front to Louisiana high society. Jace is officially joining the firm this week. We need to introduce him to our shipping partners with the respect he deserves." I turned my gaze to Jace. "You are bringing him into the logistics firm. He does not know a cargo manifest from a cocktail menu." Jace bristled, his smug smile faltering. "I bring fresh vision to the table, Eden. Something the old guard desperately needs. You bring nothing to the table," I countered, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the room. "I run that company, Charles. I negotiate the port leases. I secure the freight routes. I keep the lights on while you play golf. You will not drain my savings to throw a party for a man who cannot even spell supply chain." Charles stood up, planting both palms flat on the table. The illusion of the genteel Southern patriarch vanished, revealing the ruthless businessman beneath. "You seem to forget who owns the building you work in," Eden Charles threatened, his voice laced with pure venom. "You seem to forget who put you in that corner office. I can replace you by Friday. You will pay this invoice, or you will find yourself locked out of your own career. Do not test my authority." I looked at my father. Really looked at him and realized the man who raised me was entirely gone, replaced by a fragile ego terrified of losing status. I stood up from the table. Declan rose beside me, towering over Jace, who wisely took a step back. "Keep your job, Charles," I said softly, "and keep the invoice." I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving my untouched dinner behind. As we stepped out into the humid Louisiana night, my pulse thrummed with a terrifying clarity. They thought they were punishing me. They thought I would come crawling back by morning, checkbook in hand, begging for my position at the firm. They had no idea that they had just forced my hand. I was not going to write them a check. I was going to sever the lifeline keeping their entire empire afloat. And the real theft was waiting for me on Monday morning. The Monday morning air rolling off the Mississippi River tasted of diesel exhaust and damp earth. I arrived at the glass and steel headquarters of Barbier Maritime Logistics at my usual time of 6:45. The corporate lobby was a silent cavern of polished concrete and brushed steel, designed to project authority. I walked toward the private executive elevators, holding my iced coffee, my mind already organizing the freight schedules for a fleet of incoming cargo vessels. I held my badge against the security scanner. Instead of the familiar green chime, the reader emitted a dull, flat buzz. The LED indicator flashed red. Access denied. I tried again. Another red flash, another hollow buzz. Miss Barbier. The voice belonged to the head of building security. He stepped out from behind the reception desk, looking everywhere except at my face. His uniform collar seemed suddenly too tight for his neck. I have orders to escort you up to the 7th floor boardroom. Your credentials have been temporarily suspended. A cold knot formed in the center of my stomach, pulling tight. I did not ask questions. I handed him my useless keycard and followed him into the elevator. The ride up was silent, the hum of the cables the only sound in the confined space. When the steel doors parted on the 7th floor, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The executive suite was a masterclass in intimidation, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling port of New Orleans. The security guard stepped aside, gesturing toward the frosted glass doors of the primary conference room. I pushed the doors open. My father Charles sat at the head of the long oak table, his posture rigid and commanding. My mother Vivian sat to his right, wearing a tailored navy blazer and a serene, untouchable expression. Flanking them were two senior corporate attorneys from a ruthless downtown firm, their briefcases open, documents fanned out across the polished wood. "Have a seat, Eden," Charles directed, pointing to the chair opposite him. I remained standing. The iced coffee in my hand suddenly felt like a ridiculous prop. I set it down on the nearest credenza and crossed my arms. "Say whatever it is you brought me here to say, Charles." The senior attorney cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He slid a thick stack of legal filings across the table. "According to an emergency session of the board held late last night, your position as Vice President of Operations has been terminated, effective immediately." I looked at my father. "You are firing me because I refused to pay for a catering bill Vivienne offered." A soft, patronizing sigh. "Do not be dramatic, darling. This is a strategic restructuring. Jace brings a fresh perspective to our executive team. We need leadership that understands the value of family unity and public image." I laughed, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed off the glass walls. "Jace does not know the difference between a bulk carrier and a tugboat. You are handing the reins of a multi-million-dollar logistics hub to a man whose only qualification is marrying your favorite daughter." "We are doing what is best for the Barbier legacy," Charles stated, his voice devoid of any parental warmth. "But termination is only half the agenda today." He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit and withdrew a vintage gold fountain pen. The object possessed a heavy, gleaming history. My grandfather bought it in Paris after signing his first international shipping contract. It was a symbol of ultimate authority within our family, passed down to Charles upon his ascension to CEO. My father unscrewed the cap, the metallic scrape loud in the tense room. He tapped the gold nib against a secondary stack of papers. "The attorneys have reviewed the family trust," Charles continued. "Upon your recent marriage to Declan, a specific marital property clause was triggered. The majority voting shares you accumulated over the last 5 years were never independently yours. They were vested under the umbrella of the estate. Because you are now legally tied to a spouse outside the firm, those shares revert back to the primary trust to protect our corporate assets." The air vanished from the room. My heart slammed against my ribs as the sheer scale of their betrayal came into focus. They were not just firing me. They were executing a hostile takeover of my own equity. "That is theft," I said, keeping my voice chillingly even. "I earned those shares through performance bonuses and direct salary sacrifices. I built this company from a regional dispatcher into an international brokerage. You cannot just erase my ownership with a fabricated technicality." The attorney folded his hands. "It is entirely legal, Miss Barbier. The board ratified the interpretation at midnight. The shares have already been transferred into a new holding account managed by the new executive director." Managed by Jace, I deduced the puzzle pieces, locking into a grotesque picture. Charles smiled, a thin, triumphant line across his face. He leaned over the documents, pressing the gold nib to the signature line. The ink pooled rich and dark as he finalized the theft of my life's work. "You are a consultant now," Eden Charles sneered, waving the document in the air to dry the ink. "We will pay you a modest retainer to advise Jace from a distance. If you behave, we might even reconsider your inheritance down the line." I did not scream. I did not flip the table or beg for my position. I turned my head and looked through the transparent glass walls of the boardroom directly across the hall into my corner office. Jace was sitting in my ergonomic leather chair. He wore a brand new designer suit, looking every bit the corporate conqueror. But his posture betrayed his panic. He was leaning close to the dual monitors, furiously clicking the computer mouse, his face flushed red. He slammed the mouse against the desk in frustration, cursing at the screen. The logistics terminals were locked. The user interface on those screens was not standard industry software. It was a highly specialized, proprietary digital architecture I had coded myself over 3 grueling years. It tracked cargo tonnage, managed customs clearances, and optimized shipping routes through the complex Mississippi Delta. The system required specific command prompts and analytical inputs. Jace was staring at a digital fortress he had no idea how to breach. My parents had stolen my title. They had stolen my voting rights. But they had failed to realize that they only seized the shell of the vehicle. I owned the engine. I turned back to the table, looking at the arrogant, satisfied faces of the people who raised me. They expected tears. They expected a breakdown. They wanted me to sign the consulting agreement and accept my demotion with grateful submission. I picked up the consulting contract. I did not use the gold pen. I tore the thick packet in half, dropping the shredded pieces directly onto the polished oak table. "I will pack my own box," I said. Charles opened his mouth to shout, his face darkening with fury, but I was already walking out the door. I strode across the hallway and pushed open the door to my office. Jace jumped in the chair, startled by my sudden entrance. "Having trouble with the routing protocols, Jace?" I asked smoothly, grabbing a cardboard box from the supply closet. He scrambled to sit up straight, adjusting his expensive tie. "The interface is overly complicated, Eden. You need to sit down and walk me through the access codes. Your father said you are consulting for me now." I ignored him. I pulled my framed maritime industry awards off the wall. I tossed my personal notebooks into the box. I unplugged my customized keyboard, the one coded to the software shortcuts, and dropped it on top of my files. "I am not your consultant, Jace," I said, hoisting the box into my arms. "I am your worst nightmare. Enjoy the captain's chair. I hear this ship sinks fast." I walked out of the office down the long corridor and into the elevator without looking back. As I stepped out of the air-conditioned lobby and into the brutal Louisiana heat, a profound, terrifying calm settled over me. My parents thought they had amputated a dead limb to save their golden child. They were completely unaware that they had just ripped out the only heart keeping their empire alive. And the proprietary software patents trapped in my head were about to become the most expensive mistake Charles Barbier ever made. The fluorescent hum of the kitchen pendant lights cast a sterile glow over our granite island. Declan had spread the 50-page severance and trust transfer packet across the counter, weighing down the corners with our ceramic coffee mugs. He held a yellow highlighter, his eyes tracking line by line through the dense legal jargon my parents had weaponized against me. Before I met him, Declan spent his days dismantling fraudulent shell corporations for a ruthless downtown litigation firm. He possessed a mind built for identifying structural weaknesses. Right now, his focus was surgical. "They laid a highly sophisticated trap," Declan murmured, his voice a low rumble of protective fury. He capped the highlighter and tapped the plastic end against a clause buried deep in Section 4. Charles utilized a very obscure interpretation of community property statutes. By linking your equity directly to the family trust original charter, he essentially legally kidnapped your voting rights. I leaned against the stainless steel refrigerator, the cold metal seeping through my silk blouse. So he won. Declan looked up, a sharp, dangerous spark igniting in his dark eyes. Charles won the battle for the corporate shell. But your father possesses a fatal blind spot. He views logistics as a blue-collar trade, something beneath his country club pedigree. He never bothered to understand how your digital infrastructure actually functions. Declan slid a separate sheet of paper toward me. It was an intellectual property addendum I had filed 3 years ago, long before Camille even met Jace. They seized the company's shares, Declan stated, a predatory smile touching his lips. But they failed to secure the patents. The routing algorithms, the customs clearance automation, the proprietary software that keeps those cargo ships moving on schedule. Those patents are registered strictly under your name. Charles owns the desks. You own the nervous system. I closed my eyes. The sterile smell of the kitchen faded, replaced by the heavy, pungent scent of river mud and blooming jasmine. I was 12 years old again, standing on the murky banks of the Mississippi River with my grandfather, Louis. He was the man who actually built the Barbier Empire, hauling freight on rusted barges before Charles inherited the throne and polished it. Louis had hands like weathered leather and a gaze that could strip the paint off a hull. We were watching a grand, ornate riverboat struggle against the current, its paddle wheel choked by submerged debris. I had asked him why such a beautiful ship was sinking. Louis crouched beside me, scooping up a handful of thick, dark silt. The bayou swallows weak foundations, Eden, he had told me, his voice gravelly and deep. People get distracted by the fresh paint and the brass bells, but if the hull is compromised, the river claims it. He dropped the mud, wiping his hands on his denim overalls. Remember this. Loyalty is earned through integrity. Blood is just water if it is poisoned. That memory, buried for over a decade, surged to the surface and crystallized my resolve. My parents had chosen decorative trim over structural integrity. They chose Camille's socialite status and Jace's empty bravado. I no longer needed their toxic loyalty. I opened my eyes, the ghost of my grandfather's wisdom steadying my pulse. "Hand me my laptop," I told Declan. I walked into my home office, shutting the door against the quiet of the house. I did not waste time mourning the loss of my family. I had a digital nervous system to sell. I opened my contact directory, bypassing the regional partners Charles played golf with. I aimed higher. I targeted the apex predators of the shipping industry. I made 3 phone calls. The first 2 were strategic, generating immediate industry chatter that Eden Barbier was a free agent, holding the keys to the most efficient logistics software in the Gulf Coast. The third call was the strike. I dialed the direct line of a Texas-based private equity firm known for devouring inefficient supply chains. Their managing partner, a man named Holden, possessed a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Eden Holden answered, his tone laced with calculated curiosity. "Rumor says you walked out of Barbier Maritime today. I assumed Charles would chain you to the desk before letting you leave." "Charles decided to restructure," I replied, keeping my tone crisp and devoid of emotion. "He promoted his new son-in-law to executive director, a man with 0 maritime experience. The Barbier infrastructure is about to experience critical failure." Holden chuckled, a dry, raspy sound over the receiver. "A tragedy for them. What is the opportunity for me? I hold the exclusive intellectual property rights to the routing and custom software," I explained, staring at the flashing cursor on my monitor. "The system that reduced port bottlenecking by 40% last quarter. I am offering your firm an exclusive perpetual licensing agreement. You integrate my software into your Gulf operations, and you will dominate the Delta by fiscal year end." The line went silent, as Holden processed the sheer scale of the leverage I was offering. "What is the price for the keys to the kingdom?" $50 million, I stated without hesitation. "Liquid, transferred by close of business tomorrow." He did not haggle. He recognized a desperate empire when he saw one, and he knew my algorithm was the weapon that could conquer it. "Send over the contracts." 48 hours later, I sat at my kitchen island, a cup of black tea cooling beside my tablet. My banking application refreshed. The screen displayed a pending wire transfer. $50 million. The profound gravity of that number should have warranted a celebration, a popping cork, a moment of dizzying triumph. I felt none of that. I felt the cold, hard weight of ammunition. I did not purchase a sports car to parade past my parents' estate. I did not book a revenge vacation to a tropical island. I picked up my phone and called a boutique corporate structuring firm located out of state, far beyond Charles's sphere of influence. "I need to establish an anonymous holding company," I instructed the managing partner. "Ironclad privacy barriers, multiple proxy layers. I want it registered in Delaware, but operating in Louisiana." "What is the name of the entity?" the lawyer asked, his keyboard clacking in the background. I looked out the window, watching the heavy Spanish moss sway in the gathering afternoon breeze. "Delta Vanguard LLC." The paperwork was expedited. By the end of the week, Delta Vanguard was a fully operational, weaponized financial entity. My parents and Jace were currently popping champagne in the Barbier boardroom, celebrating their flawless theft of my career. They thought they had secured their legacy. They had no idea they were sitting in a wooden boat with a gaping hole in the hull. I mapped out my next maneuver on a legal pad. The $50 million was not a retirement fund. It was a war chest. Charles and Vivian controlled the corporate title, but Barbier Maritime Logistics rested upon a very specific foundation. The company leased $105 million worth of prime commercial port real estate along the Mississippi River. The physical dirt, the docks, the warehouses, the loading cranes. If Jace crashed the company's operating revenue, those real estate leases would inevitably default to their primary lenders. If my family wanted to play ruthless corporate games to fund Camille's vanity, I was not just going to sue them for wrongful termination. I was going to let Jace drive the company straight into financial ruin. And when he desperately searched for a lifeline to hide his failure from my father, Delta Vanguard would be waiting in the shadows, ready to purchase their distressed debt. I was going to legally acquire the very ground their empire stood on. But to guarantee Jace took the bait, I needed to convince them I was defeated. I needed to disappear into plain sight. I sat in the quiet sanctuary of my home office, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. The mahogany desk felt cool beneath my fingertips as I executed a flawless digital misdirection. Survival often requires playing the fool. I navigated to my professional networking profile, hovering the cursor over my portrait. With a single click, a bright green ring materialized around my face. Open to work. I carefully crafted a status update, injecting the perfect tone of polite, humiliating desperation. I requested leads for entry-level freight dispatching roles. I mentioned being eager to start over from the ground up. It was a demotion of catastrophic proportions, a digital white flag, fluttering for my entire industry to observe. I hit publish and waited for the bait to be taken. It took less than 45 minutes. My phone buzzed against the desk. A former colleague sent me a direct message containing a screenshot. Camille had captured my profile update and plastered it across her private social media story for all of Baton Rouge high society to witness. She decorated the image with crying laughing emojis and a single word typed in bold pink font. Sad. My sister was broadcasting my fabricated downfall, drinking up the attention like expensive champagne at a victory parade. She needed me to be a failure to validate her own stolen success. I stared at the screen, feeling the phantom sting of her mockery. I did not text her back. I did not defend myself. I simply offered a cool, quiet smile to the empty room. The camouflage was functioning flawlessly. Let them laugh. Arrogance always blinds a person to the ground crumbling beneath their feet. While my family spent their days gloating over my perceived exile, I spent my nights coordinating a silent siege. My primary weapon was a woman named Sloane. She operated as a forensic auditor, possessing a mind like a steel trap and a profound distaste for corporate politics. 5 years ago, I found her working in a cramped, windowless cubicle at a rival firm. Her superiors routinely stole credit for her brilliant financial modeling because she lacked the outgoing charisma required to fight back. I hired her, doubled her salary, and gave her total autonomy. Her loyalty to me was forged in mutual respect and shared competence. Now she acted as my phantom, tracking the internal hemorrhage of Barbier Maritime Logistics from a secure, encrypted server. The reports Sloane delivered each evening were staggering in their severity. Without my proprietary routing algorithms, Jace was flying blind through a hurricane. The legacy software systems he attempted to revive were archaic and prone to crashing under heavy data loads. Cargo vessels sat anchored out in the Gulf of Mexico for days, racking up astronomical daily demurrage fees. The staging warehouses were overflowing with delayed shipments, the scent of rotting agricultural freight causing complaints from local port authorities. Major freight forwarders were threatening to cancel lucrative contracts due to chronically missed delivery deadlines. The carefully oiled machine I had built was grinding to a halt under the profound incompetence of the new executive director. Jace was actively hiding the decay from Charles. My father only cared about the quarterly profit summaries and maintaining his elite standing at the local country club. Jace fed him doctored projections, painting a rosy picture of growth to buy himself time. But time in the logistics industry requires immense capital. The operational loans keeping the business afloat were rapidly reaching their maturity dates. Cash flow was drying up. Jace was missing the minimum payments to the regional banks. If those lenders called in the debt, the firm would face immediate insolvency. Charles would discover his golden son-in-law was a fraud, and the illusion of the perfect Barbier family would shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. Jace needed a bailout. He needed it fast, quiet, and far away from traditional Louisiana banking circles where rumors flowed faster than the muddy river currents. He began sending discreet inquiries to private equity firms out of state. He wanted a debt restructuring deal to cover his tracks and replenish the operating accounts before the upcoming board meeting. Sloane intercepted these distress signals with surgical precision. She carefully maneuvered Delta Vanguard into his line of sight, utilizing a labyrinth of blind trusts and proxy directors to mask any connection to me. We positioned Delta Vanguard as an emerging Texas-based investment group looking to acquire distressed maritime assets. Sloane crafted a prospectus that promised exactly what Jace craved: a hefty cash injection with extended repayment terms. It presented as a miracle. It looked like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man in the dead of night. The negotiations took place entirely over encrypted emails and secure conference calls. Sloane utilized a voice modulator, acting as the senior acquisition director for our shell company. I listened in on the primary pitch, sitting in my dark office, the ambient light of the monitor casting long shadows against the wall. Declan stood behind my chair, his hands resting on my shoulders, his thumb tracing a slow, grounding circle on my collarbone. Jace sounded frantic over the speakerphone. His usual slick bravado was gone, replaced by a reedy, desperate pitch. I could picture the dark circles forming under his eyes, the wrinkled linen suits replacing his polished exterior. He tried to project strength, claiming the firm was experiencing a minor cash flow hiccup due to seasonal market fluctuations. Sloane did not indulge his fiction. She kept her tone clinical, harsh, and entirely unyielding. We offered to purchase $40 million of Barbier Maritime distress debt at a steep discount from their original lenders. Delta Vanguard would assume the loans, becoming the sole primary creditor to my family's firm. The interest rate we proposed was steep, borderline punitive, but Jace possessed zero leverage. He was trapped in a cage of his own making. However, the true danger was buried deep within the collateral clause. In his intense haste to secure the funds before Charles returned from a weekend golf tournament in Augusta, Jace committed a fatal corporate sin. He bypassed his senior legal counsel. He did not mandate independent auditors to vet the ownership structure of Delta Vanguard. He was too terrified of exposure to invite any internal scrutiny. He just wanted the cash to balance the ledgers, pay the overdue shipping fines, and save his own skin. Utilizing his newly granted executive powers, he authorized the restructuring agreement. By signing that specific contract, Jace legally secured the $40 million debt against the physical assets of the firm: the docks, the staging warehouses, the sprawling port real estate dotting the Mississippi Delta. He leveraged $105 million of generational land to cover a $40 million mistake. He handed the keys to the kingdom to a phantom. I watched the digital signature render on my screen. Sloan forwarded the finalized, notarized document directly to my secure inbox. The transaction cleared the banking hurdles. The debt transferred. Delta Vanguard was officially the apex predator holding the leash to my family's empire. Declan leaned down, pressing a warm kiss to the crown of my head. "You own them," he murmured, his voice thick with pride and justice. I stared at the electronic document tracing the erratic, panicked lines of Jace's digital signature. My parents believed they had exiled me to the wasteland of failure. Camille truly thought I was weeping over entry-level job boards humiliated and broken. Jace thought he had outsmarted a severe financial crisis. They were all dancing on a stage I now owned. The trap was fully constructed, the steel jaws pulled back and waiting in the shadows. All I needed was the perfect public venue to snap it shut. And Jace, driven by his endless arrogance, was about to hand-deliver the perfect opportunity wrapped in a country club invitation. The air pressure inside the exclusive New Orleans Country Club dropped as a dark weather front gathered over the Gulf. I could feel the shift in my bones. Louisiana storms do not arrive quietly. They announce themselves with a heavy, suffocating stillness, followed by a sudden plunge in temperature that makes the hair on your arms stand up. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, charcoal clouds swallowed the afternoon sun, casting the sprawling emerald golf course into twilight. The oppressive summer humidity was finally breaking, signaling a tempest. Inside the clubhouse lounge, the atmosphere remained shielded by climate control and the pervasive scent of old money. The room smelled of aged cedar, expensive cigar smoke, and citrus polish. I sat tucked away in a high-backed leather wing chair in the corner alcove obscured by a towering potted palm and the deep shadows of the room. I wore a simple black sheath dress, holding a tall glass of unsweetened iced tea. The ice cubes clinked softly as I brought the rim to my lips. I was not there to socialize. I was hunting. Heavy footsteps approached the antique mahogany bar across the room. I recognized the arrogant cadence immediately. Charles and Jace walked into the lounge, their voices carrying over the low hum of jazz playing through the hidden speakers. My father moved with his usual rigid entitlement, though his shoulders looked slightly tighter than normal, betraying the immense financial stress he had been carrying. Jace trailed half a step behind him, attempting to mimic the posture of a Southern aristocrat, but lacking the inherent grace. They took a seat at my father's preferred table, a prime spot near the windows. The bartender, a man who had served Charles for 2 decades, materialized instantly with 2 gin martinis. Jace unbuttoned his designer suit jacket, leaning back and throwing one arm over the adjacent chair. He looked like a man who had just conquered a continent, rather than a parasite who had nearly bankrupted a generational logistics firm in under a month. "I told you to trust my vision," Charles Jace boasted, lifting his martini glass. The crystal caught the dim light of the lounge. "We just secured a sweetheart debt restructuring deal from a Texas private equity firm. The capital injection hits the operational accounts by tomorrow morning. The port leases are safe, the fleet is fueled, the entire liquidity crisis is solved." I watched Charles exhale. The breath left his lungs in a long, shaky sigh, the physical manifestation of sheer panic leaving his body. He took a deep swallow of his gin, his rigid posture melting into the plush upholstery. "I admit I was concerned when the regional banks flagged our missed payments." Charles replied, his tone low, but carrying easily across the quiet room. The whispers in this very club were starting to become unbearable. People look for weakness in this industry. They circle like sharks. But you pulled it off, Jace. You found outside capital when the local lenders closed their doors. Jace smirked, swirling the clear liquid in his glass. Those local bankers lack imagination. This Texas firm saw the underlying value of our operation. They offered me an incredible runway. I negotiated a deferment on the principal for the first 2 quarters. They practically handed us a blank check to get the freight schedules back on track. My lips curved into a cold, silent smile. The irony was so rich, it was almost tangible. Jace was sitting 20 feet away from me, boasting about outsmarting a faceless group of corporate executives. He had no idea that the Texas firm was a phantom. He had no idea he was celebrating a deal orchestrated by the daughter he had just helped cast into the street. Even better, the arrogant social climber had neglected to read the fine print. I knew exactly what the contract stipulated because I drafted the terms myself. Yes, the initial interest payments were deferred. Yes, the cash injection provided immediate relief, but the collateral clause was a masterpiece of lethal corporate architecture. To secure the funds quickly, without undergoing a prolonged audit, Jace had signed away the rights to the physical earth beneath their feet. If the firm missed a single balloon payment, or if the executive board violated any fiduciary covenants, Delta Vanguard possessed the immediate legal right to foreclose on $105 million in port real estate. Jace had essentially traded the family castle for a bucket of water to put out a fire he started himself. Charles tapped his knuckles against the table, a gesture of profound approval. "You proved your worth today, son. This is exactly the kind of aggressive maneuvering Barbier Maritime needed. We were growing stagnant. We needed fresh blood to shake up the old paradigms." Jace leaned forward, eager to cement his victory by standing on my neck. It takes a certain level of sophisticated financial literacy to orchestrate a leveraged buyout of distressed debt. Jace sneered, his voice dripping with condescension, something Eden could never pull off. She was just a glorified dispatcher, staring at routing screens all day. She lacked the vision for high-level corporate finance. Charles nodded, taking another sip of his martini. Eden was too cautious, too attached to the mundane details. She built a decent foundation, but she never understood how to play the real game. Let her consult for a mid-tier freight forwarder. The logistics empire requires a king, not a clerk. The words should have stung. A year ago, hearing my father erase a decade of my grueling labor to stroke the ego of a fraudulent grifter would have devastated me. I would have spent weeks seeking his validation, working late into the night just to prove my worth. But sitting in the shadows of the country club, listening to the thunder rattle the glass panes, I felt nothing but a profound, liberating detachment. Their insults were just hollow echoes in an empty room. They were men standing on a trap door, mocking the person holding the lever. The heavy mahogany doors of the lounge swung open. Camille swept into the room, bringing a cloud of expensive floral perfume and chaotic energy. She wore a pristine white tennis skirt and a silk blouse, her hair perfectly blown out from a morning at the spa. She zeroed in on her husband and my father, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "Tell me the good news," Camille demanded, dropping her designer tote onto an empty chair. "The caterers for the reception are threatening to pull the floral arrangements if we do not wire the final installment by 5 o'clock. Jace stood up, pressing a kiss to her cheek. "Wire the funds, sweetheart. The new capital is secured. The gala is fully funded. We are going to throw the most spectacular party Baton Rouge has ever seen." Camille clapped her hands together, a genuine squeal of delight escaping her lips. "Oh, thank God. The country club board members have been asking questions. Now we can finally show everyone that the Barbiers are stronger than ever." She paused, signaling the waiter for a glass of champagne. "Have we received a response from Eden yet? I sent the invitation to her little townhouse just to be polite." Charles scoffed. "If she has any sense of shame, she will decline. She cannot afford a gift worthy of this venue anyway. Best she stays home and tends to her wounded pride." Jace laughed a sharp, cruel sound. "Maybe she can knit us a blanket." I looked down at the condensation pooling at the base of my glass. I traced a slow circle through the water with my index finger. I had already mailed my RSVP to Camille. I checked the box, confirming my attendance. I would not miss this gala for anything in the world. Outside, the storm finally broke. A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the golf course, followed instantly by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the crystal glasses on the bar. The sky opened up, unleashing a torrential downpour against the windows. The country club patrons murmured, watching the violent weather wash over the manicured lawns. I set my glass down on the side table. The ice shifted a quiet clink in the shadows. I stood up, smoothing the skirt of my dress. Charles, Camille, and Jace were too busy toasting their fabricated victory to notice me slip through the side exit of the lounge. As I walked down the carpeted hallway toward the valet stand, the adrenaline began to sing in my veins. My family wanted a spectacle. They wanted to parade their stolen wealth in front of 500 members of high society. They wanted to humiliate me by flaunting the empire they stole. I smiled as the valet handed me my keys. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. The stage was set. The audience was invited. The guillotine was sharpened. The countdown to their public execution had officially begun, and I held the only rope. The sky above Baton Rouge finally fractured just after sunset. Rain lashed against the windshield of Declan's car in thick sheets, blurring the streetlights into smeared streaks of yellow. We pulled up to the grand entrance of the country club, the tires hissing against the wet pavement. A valet rushed forward with a heavy black umbrella, shielding us from the deluge as we stepped out into the humid night air. Inside, the foyer smelled of damp wool coats and expensive perfume. I handed my trench coat to the attendant, smoothing the fabric of my floor-length emerald gown. Declan stood beside me, adjusting his silver cufflinks. He did not come from old money. He grew up the son of a high school principal and a pediatric nurse, learning early that respect was earned through discipline, not inherited through a surname. His presence beside me was a steady, grounding force against the superficial theater we were about to enter. We pushed through the gilded double doors and walked into the main ballroom. The sheer scale of the excess was staggering. My family had burned through hundreds of thousands of dollars for this single evening. Towering centerpieces of white orchids draped over every table. A string quartet played in the corner, their music struggling to compete with the roar of 500 elite guests. Waiters navigated the sea of silk and velvet, carrying silver trays stacked with caviar and crystal champagne flutes. This was the grand illusion. A financial house of cards standing on a foundation of distressed debt, all designed to convince high society that the Barbier legacy remained untouchable. I felt the stares the moment we entered. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Eyes darted toward me, then quickly away. The narrative my mother had carefully seeded through her social circles was clear. I was the bitter, ousted older sister, the woman who lacked the vision to keep up with the new corporate direction. I kept my chin elevated and my pace measured, walking right into the center of their judgment. Camille stood near the elevated stage, radiant in a custom silk gown that cost more than a starter home. Jace hovered beside her, holding a scotch, shaking hands with regional shipping magnates he had never met before this month. Jace spent his youth on the fringes of real wealth, always looking through the window at parties like this. That deep-seated insecurity drove his desperate need to project dominance tonight. He laughed too loud, slapped backs too hard, and wore his new executive title like an ill-fitting crown. A sharp chime rang out as Camille tapped a manicured fingernail against the microphone. The crystal chandelier suspended above the dance floor seemed to vibrate from the feedback. The ballroom quieted the elite crowd, turning their attention to the golden child. I want to thank my parents for throwing us this spectacular celebration, Camille cooed into the mic, her voice breathless and practiced. She beamed down at Charles, who raised his glass in patriarchal approval. But mostly, I want to thank them for finally finding a real businessman to join the family in my husband Jace. Polite applause echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Camille leaned closer to the microphone, her eyes scanning the room until they locked onto me. The sweet facade melted into a venomous smirk. "And a toast to my older sister, Eden," Camille continued, her tone dripping with mock sympathy, "for trying her best with her little consulting gig. We are all rooting for you to find your footing." Laughter cascaded through the ballroom. It was the polished, cruel laughter of a social circle that thrives on hierarchy and humiliation. Declan stiffened beside me, his jaw clenching tight enough to crack a tooth. I placed a steadying hand on his forearm. My heart maintained its slow, rhythmic beat. My hands did not tremble. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, feeling the cool liquid slide down my throat. I turned away from the stage and walked toward the back of the room, seeking a moment of quiet near a towering ice sculpture carved into the shape of a swan. The frozen bird was already beginning to melt in the heat of the crowded room, water dripping slowly into a silver catch basin. Vivian intercepted me before I could reach the shadows. She wore a sapphire gown, her diamonds catching the ambient light. My mother spent her entire adult life guarding the polished veneer of the Barbier name. To her, reality was far less important than reputation. "Your presence here is an embarrassment," Vivian hissed, stepping uncomfortably close. Her smile remained fixed for the benefit of any onlookers, but her voice was laced with pure acid. "Everyone is staring at you. You look pathetic standing there. After everything your sister has achieved, leave before you ruin the professional photos." I looked at the woman who had birthed me, searching for any trace of maternal warmth. There was nothing left but cold, calculating pride. I simply smiled, taking a moment to adjust the delicate emerald fabric of my gown. "I am just here to appraise the property, Mother," I replied, my voice light and conversational. Vivian blinked, her practiced smile faltering, the confusion etched lines around her eyes. "Appraise the property?" She repeated the words, making zero sense in her highly curated world. "What are you talking about?" I did not answer. I walked past her, leaving her standing bewildered next to the weeping ice sculpture. I navigated the dense crowd, tracing a direct path toward the bar, where Jace was ordering another round of drinks for his new audience of sycophants. He did not see me approach from his blind side. His bespoke tuxedo smelled of expensive cologne and unearned arrogance. I reached into the small clutch purse hidden in the folds of my dress. I pulled out a heavy cream envelope sealed with a plain wax stamp. Without breaking my stride, I brushed past him, sliding the thick envelope directly into his breast pocket. "A wedding gift," I whispered near his ear. He turned, startled, but I was already moving toward the grand double doors. Declan met me at the exit, offering his arm. We stepped out of the stifling heat of the ballroom and into the chaotic fury of the Louisiana storm. The rain was relentless, washing the heavy scent of the country club from my skin. Before we reached the valet stand, I paused and glanced back through the towering glass panels of the foyer doors. Inside the gilded cage, Jace had set his drink down. He reached into his pocket and broke the wax seal on the envelope. I watched him unfold the document. It was a formal, legally binding, $40 million notice of default from Delta Vanguard LLC. The physical reaction was instantaneous. The blood drained from his face so fast his tan looked like cheap paint. His mouth fell open in a silent, jagged gasp. He stumbled backward, colliding with a passing waiter. Champagne glasses shattered across the hardwood floor. Jace ignored the mess, grabbing Charles by the arm with frantic, clawing fingers. Panic exploded in my father's eyes as Jace shoved the default notice into his chest. I turned away from the glass, linking my fingers through Declan's hand. The valet brought the car around and we slid into the dry, quiet sanctuary of the leather seats. The engine purred, cutting through the sound of the driving rain. As we drove away from the country club, a profound, exquisite peace settled over my chest. I knew I was going to sleep soundly for the first time in 6 months. But the quiet would not last. The countdown to their ruin had officially begun, and cornered animals do not surrender quietly. When Monday morning arrived, the banks would freeze the corporate accounts, and Jace would realize exactly who owned his debt. Facing total exposure, he would not confess to his failures. He would lash out, dragging the family into a desperate, dirty fight, forcing me to dig deeper into the company ledgers where a much darker criminal secret was waiting to be uncovered. Monday dawn broke with the color of bruised iron. By 9 o'clock, the financial guillotine dropped. The regional banks, alerted to the Delta Vanguard default notice, froze every operating account tied to Barbier Maritime Logistics. Corporate credit lines ceased to function. Fuel vendors denied the morning barge fill-ups. The sprawling logistics empire, a beast requiring constant capital to breathe, suffocated before lunch. I sat in my home office watching the market indicators on my terminal. Declan placed a cup of black coffee on my desk, his presence a silent anchor against the incoming tide. The trap had snapped shut, trapping my family inside a nightmare of their own design. Instead of facing reality, they chose a familiar weapon: deflection. By early afternoon, my phone began vibrating continuously. A barrage of notifications lit up the screen. I opened my primary social media application. Camille had uploaded a highly produced, tearful video. She sat on the edge of her lavish bed, wearing an oversized cashmere sweater, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. She cast herself as the ultimate victim. "My sister has always harbored deep jealousy," Camille sobbed into the camera, her voice trembling with practiced theatricality. "She resented my happiness. She could not stand seeing Jace bring fresh success to our family business. So she hacked into the corporate mainframes. She manipulated the data to destroy my marriage and ruin our livelihoods." The video spread like a digital wildfire. Vivian mobilized her extensive network of country club wives and charity board members, pouring gasoline on the narrative. The Baton Rouge elite thrived on scandal, and my mother spoon-fed them a masterpiece. High society circles began whispering. The rumors painted me as a bitter, unhinged outcast executing an illegal cyber attack out of pure spite. My mother demanded public sympathy, framing her golden child as a martyr. The digital assault began to manifest in the physical world. A respected freight forwarder I had done business with for 6 years sent me a hesitant email asking if the rumors regarding corporate sabotage were true. Another colleague canceled a scheduled lunch. My professional reputation, the pristine armor I had forged through 80-hour work weeks and relentless dedication, faced an unprecedented siege. The isolation felt palpable, a cold shadow creeping across my desk. Declan leaned against the doorframe, watching my jaw tighten. He did not offer hollow reassurances. He understood the stakes. Lions do not lose sleep over the opinions of sheep, he stated, his voice a steady rumble of unwavering conviction. Let them scream into the void, Eden. You hold the receipts. He was right. I ignored the notifications. I did not record a rebuttal. I did not type a frantic defense. Defending yourself against a narcissist only validates their fabricated reality. I closed the social media applications and opened a secure, encrypted communication channel. Sloane, my phantom auditor, had spent the weekend finalizing her forensic dive into the company ledgers. While Camille played the victim for internet strangers, Sloane was hunting monsters in the math. A heavily encrypted file arrived in my inbox at 3:15. The subject line contained a single word: checkmate. I downloaded the dossier, my eyes scanning the dense spreadsheets and banking wire logs. I expected to find gross incompetence. I expected to see Jace blowing company funds on expensive dinners, luxury car leases, and tailored suits. I assumed he was just a foolish social climber trying to maintain a billionaire lifestyle on a millionaire budget. I was wrong. Jace was not merely an incompetent nepotism hire. He was a highly calculated predator. Sloane tracked a series of complex, layered financial transfers originating from the primary Barbier operating accounts. Jace had authorized these wires under the guise of paying international shipping tariffs and obscure maritime consulting fees. But those vendors did not exist. The money flowed through a labyrinth of shell corporations registered in Delaware and Nevada, designed to wash the funds clean. I followed the digital paper trail to its final destination, a private, numbered, offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. The account belonged exclusively to Jace. A chilling realization washed over me, freezing the breath in my lungs. Jace was intentionally bankrupting my family firm. He was siphoning the remaining liquidity, bleeding the operations dry to build a hidden golden parachute. He never intended to run Barbier Maritime Logistics. He planned to drain the carcass, wait for the inevitable insolvency, divorce Camille the moment the money stopped flowing, and flee the country as a very rich man. My sister, the golden child, who mocked my humble wedding and paraded her diamond ring like a trophy, was nothing but a convenient mark. She was the unwitting key Jace used to unlock the vault. He played my parents perfectly, exploiting Charles's ego and Vivian's obsession with appearances to gain unchecked access to the corporate treasury. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The dynamic of my revenge shifted fundamentally in that moment. I initiated this hostile takeover to teach my family a lesson about discarding the foundation to polish the trim. I wanted to claim the earth beneath their feet. But viewing the Cayman Islands wire logs changed the texture of the war. If I had not established Delta Vanguard, if I had not purchased that distressed debt and forced the default, Jace would have succeeded. He would have vanished by Christmas, leaving Charles facing federal bankruptcy and Camille facing total ruin. My strategic retaliation was no longer just a hostile takeover. It was a rescue mission for the physical assets of the Mississippi Delta. I was saving the sprawling ports, the staging warehouses, and the hundreds of dock workers whose livelihoods depended on the shipping routes. I closed the dossier, locking the evidence behind a biometric firewall. The smear campaign raging outside my windows felt inconsequential now. Camille could cry on camera until her tear ducts dried up. Vivian could rally every socialite in Louisiana to denounce my name. None of it altered the cold, hard reality of the ticking clock. Delta Vanguard held the primary lien on $105 million of commercial real estate. The foreclosure process was already in motion. Jace's hidden theft only accelerated my timeline. I needed to amputate him from the company before he could execute another wire transfer. Outside, the weather refused to break. The storm that began at the country club had intensified into a howling gale. Wind battered the sides of our home, rattling the window panes and sending loose branches skittering across the driveway. The sky turned a bruised, angry purple. I stood up to walk into the kitchen, craving a fresh cup of tea. Before I could cross the threshold, a heavy, urgent knocking echoed from the front door. The sound cut through the howling wind, frantic and desperate. Declan stepped out of the hallway, exchanging a sharp glance with me. He walked toward the foyer, peering through the security monitor, his brow furrowed. "It is your father," Declan announced, his tone dropping an octave. The digital clock on the wall glowed 4 o'clock. The smear campaign had failed to stop the foreclosure clock. The banks had demanded answers Charles could not provide. The illusion had shattered, and the proud, arrogant patriarch of the Barbier dynasty was standing in the pouring rain, reduced to begging. I took a steadying breath, preparing to introduce Charles to the true architect of his downfall. Declan stepped away from the security monitor, his broad shoulders tensing under his dark sweater. He did not say a word, just offered a single tight nod. I walked past him and reached for the deadbolt. When I pulled the heavy front door open, the Louisiana storm surged into the foyer. Hurricane-force winds whipped rain across the threshold, soaking the hardwood floor in seconds. Standing on the covered porch, illuminated by the flickering amber glow of the gas lantern, was my father, Charles Barbier. The untouchable patriarch of our logistics dynasty looked like a shipwreck survivor. His custom-tailored Italian wool suit clung to his frame, ruined and heavy with rainwater. His silver hair, usually combed back with immaculate precision, lay plastered flat against his forehead. The arrogant posture that defined his entire existence had vanished, replaced by a sunken, hollow slump. He looked 10 years older than the man who had stolen my equity with a vintage fountain pen just months ago. "Eden," he said, his voice barely audible over the roaring wind. "I need to speak with you." I stood in the doorway, blocking his entry. I did not rush to hand him a towel. I did not offer a warm embrace. I studied the deep, terrified lines etched around his mouth. The banking freeze had executed its intended psychological toll. "Come in," I instructed, my tone flat. He stepped inside, his leather shoes squishing softly against the floor. Declan closed the door, sealing us off from the howling gale outside. The sudden quiet of the foyer amplified the sound of water dripping from my father's cuffs. I turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving him to follow. I moved behind the sprawling granite island, creating a physical barrier between us. I grabbed a ceramic mug from the cabinet and poured a measure of hot black coffee from the carafe. I slid the mug across the smooth stone surface. It stopped directly in front of him. Charles wrapped his trembling hands around the porcelain, desperate for the warmth. He did not take a sip. He just stared down at the dark liquid, struggling to find the words to surrender his pride. "The banks froze the operating accounts this morning," Charles began, his voice gravelly and raw. "The regional lenders rejected our emergency appeals. The freight carriers are threatening to drop their cargo at the docks and walk away." I leaned against the back counter, crossing my arms. "And why is that, Charles?" He flinched at the use of his first name. He closed his eyes, a pained grimace twisting his features. "Jace made some mistakes." "Mistakes?" I echoed the word, tasting like ash. He was overly ambitious. Charles continued attempting to soften the catastrophic reality. He sought outside capital to bridge a minor cash flow deficit. He signed a restructuring agreement with a Texas group called Delta Vanguard. He did not consult the legal team. He did not read the collateral clauses. They hold the lien on the port real estate, and they issued a formal notice of default at Camille's reception last night. Listening to him protect Jace, even now, felt surreal. My father stood on the precipice of total bankruptcy, yet he still refused to call his golden son-in-law a failure. He labeled the embezzlement and the gross negligence as ambition. He remained entirely blind to the Cayman Islands offshore accounts Sloan had uncovered. Charles truly believed Jace was just a victim of aggressive lending tactics. I remained silent, letting him drown in the uncomfortable quiet. Charles looked up, his eyes wide and bloodshot. You have deep connections in this industry, Eden. You spent years building relationships with these private equity types. You understand how these ruthless shadow firms operate? I tilted my head, offering a slow, measured nod. I understand them perfectly. I need you to reach out to your contacts, Charles pleaded, his voice cracking. Find out who runs Delta Vanguard. Get a meeting with their managing directors. You can negotiate a grace period. Explain that the Barbier infrastructure is sound. We just need 90 days to reorganize our assets. He leaned forward, pressing his wet hands flat against the granite, leaving damp prints on the stone. If you fix this, I will reinstate you. Vice President of Operations. We will tear up that consulting contract. You can have your corner office back. We will forgive your absence and put the family back together. You owe it to the Barbier name to save the legacy your grandfather built. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his offer hung in the air. He was attempting to bribe me with the very career he had stolen. He expected me to leverage my professional reputation to rescue a man who was actively draining the corporate treasury to fund a tropical escape. I stood up straight, letting my hands fall to my sides. I walked over to my leather briefcase, resting on the edge of the counter. The brass clasps clicked loudly in the silent kitchen. I reached inside and pulled out a single thick document enclosed in a blue legal folder. I walked back to the center of the island and placed the folder next to his coffee mug. "What is this?" Charles asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I am saving you the trouble of making phone calls," I replied softly. "You wanted to know who runs Delta Vanguard. The answers are on the first page." Charles hesitated, his fingers hovering over the heavy paper. He flipped the cover open. The document bore the official seal of the state of Delaware. It was the formal Articles of Organization for Delta Vanguard LLC. The legal text was dense, outlining the holding structure and the operational authority of the firm. Charles scanned the paragraphs, his eyes darting back and forth across the ink. Then his gaze hit the bottom of the page. Listed under the designation of sole managing director, typed in bold, undeniable print, was a single name: Eden Barbier. I watched the realization strike him. It hit him with the force of a physical blow to the chest. He staggered backward, his heels catching on the hardwood floor. He bumped into the tall kitchen stool, nearly knocking it over. The color vanished from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw dropped, pulling oxygen into his lungs in ragged, shallow gasps. He looked at the paper, then up at me, then back down at the paper. His brain struggled to process the impossible mathematics of his ruin. "You," Charles whispered, the sound scraping against his throat. I offered a polite, hollow smile. "Me. You bought the debt," he stammered, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the island to remain standing. "You are the faceless Texas firm. You issued the notice of default. You are the one foreclosing on us. I licensed my proprietary software for $50 million the day after you threw me out of my own boardroom." I explained, keeping my voice chillingly calm. Jace was desperate for a lifeline. I tossed him an anvil. He caught it with both hands. The shock on my father's face began to curdle. The profound terror of losing his empire morphed into something far more familiar: righteous, blistering fury. The veins in his neck bulged against his wet collar. "You orchestrated this from the beginning," Charles roared, slamming his fist against the granite countertop. The coffee mug jumped, spilling dark liquid across the stone. You set a trap for your own family. You deliberately let Jace crash the freight schedules just so you could swoop in and steal the real estate. You stole my equity. Charles, I corrected him, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. You forged a board resolution and handed a decade of my grueling labor to a parasite. I did not steal anything. Jace signed the contract of his own free will. He leveraged the physical ports because he was too arrogant to read the collateral clause. You are a monster, he spat, pointing a trembling finger at my face. You are destroying your own blood. We are your parents. Blood is just water if it is poisoned, I quoted, echoing the lesson my grandfather taught me on the riverbank all those years ago. Charles lunged forward, grabbing the document and tearing it down the center. Tearing up a copy does not change the registry in Delaware, I noted, watching the ripped paper flutter to the floor. The foreclosure proceeds on schedule. The eviction notices for the corporate offices will be served tomorrow morning. I will give you your job back, Charles shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. I will give you your shares back. Just stop the foreclosure. I looked at him with absolute, unyielding indifference. I do not want my old job back, Charles. I want the entire company. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He realized he possessed zero leverage. He could not fire me. He could not guilt me. He could not intimidate me. The daughter he discarded had grown into a titan, and she was currently repossessing his throne. You think you have won, Charles snarled, his breath coming in heavy, jagged bursts. You think a single piece of paper makes you untouchable. We operate under Louisiana civil law. We will file an emergency injunction. We will drag you through the courts until your shadow company is bankrupt from legal fees. I will personally see to it that you never work in this state again. He turned on his heel, his wet shoes squeaking against the floorboards. He marched toward the front door, throwing it open and stepping out into the raging storm. The wind howled through the foyer, but it sounded like a whisper compared to the declaration of war he had just delivered. Declan walked up beside me, pushing the heavy door shut and engaging the deadbolt. He looked down at the spilled coffee on the granite island, then up at my face. He is going to file the injunction by morning, Declan stated, his analytical mind already preparing for the battlefield. I nodded, feeling the adrenaline sing through my veins. Let them try. They think they can use the Louisiana legal code as a shield. They do not realize they are stepping into an arena with a litigator who thrives on dismantling fraudulent empires. The family lawyers were about to mount a desperate defense, unaware that their star witness Jace was a walking liability, carrying a secret offshore bank account. The true courtroom slaughter was just beginning. True to his threat, my father deployed his legal hounds by sunrise. The petition for an emergency injunction arrived via courier just as I was pouring my morning tea. The Barbier legal team, a polished group of downtown litigators who billed by the minute, filed the motion, citing specific clauses unique to Louisiana civil law. They built their defense on the concept of D, all a civil code interpretation of fraud and bad faith, arguing that Delta Vanguard orchestrated a predatory acquisition designed to unlawfully seize generational assets. They wanted a judge to halt the foreclosure process, trapping my holding company in years of costly litigation and discovery delays. They made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed they were fighting me. They forgot I was married to Declan. Declan spent his formative years watching his mother navigate the labyrinth of hospital administration and his father mediate high-stakes union disputes. He possessed a rare genetic mutation for conflict resolution. He did not elevate his voice. He did not pound his fists on tables. He dismantled opponents using their own arrogance as the blade, finding the structural flaws in their arguments and applying precise, unbearable pressure until they collapsed. The deposition took place on a Thursday inside a neutral mediation facility near the business district. The room featured heavy oak paneling, tall, narrow windows that let in slices of harsh daylight and long shadows. It smelled faintly of lemon polish, stale coffee, and nervous sweat. I sat quietly near the back wall, hands folded in my lap, playing the role of the observant client. Charles and Vivian occupied the chairs on the opposing side of the long conference table. My mother wore a pristine cream suit, one hand resting at her throat, her fingers rhythmically tracing a strand of genuine pearls. She projected the image of a wronged matriarch, though the tight lines framing her mouth betrayed her mounting dread. Charles stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, radiating a brittle, fragile authority. Jace sat in the witness chair, flanked by two senior partners from the Barbier Legal Defense Fund. He wore a crisp blue tie and a patronizing smirk, projecting the false bravado of a man who believed his father-in-law's checkbook could purchase a favorable reality. The mediator, a retired appellate judge with a reputation for zero tolerance regarding courtroom theatrics, signaled for the recording to begin. The red light on the digital audio console glowed. Declan stood up. He did not pace around the room like a television lawyer. He simply buttoned his suit jacket, approached the center of the table, and fixed his dark gaze on Jace. "Let us review the events of the 14th, Declan began, his voice a low, steady hum that commanded the room. "You testified earlier that Barbier Maritime faced a severe liquidity crunch due to unexpected market fluctuations. To remedy this, you sought outside capital. Is that correct?" "Yes," Jace answered, adjusting his cuffs with an air of practiced nonchalance. "I took decisive action to protect the company. I found a willing lender when the regional institutions proved too conservative." Declan nodded slowly, picking up a single piece of paper from his file. He studied it for a moment before continuing. "And during these negotiations with Delta Vanguard, you authorized a restructuring agreement. This agreement secured $40 million in immediate capital by leveraging $105 million of commercial port real estate as collateral. Standard industry practice for a loan of that size," Jace replied, flashing a brief, smug glance toward Charles. "Standard," Declan echoed, letting the word linger in the heavy air. "Fascinating. According to the corporate bylaws established by Charles Barbier himself, any encumbrance of physical assets exceeding $5 million requires a formal recorded vote by the executive board." The senior Barbier attorney shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, the fabric creaking loudly in the quiet room. Vivian stopped tracing her pearls, her hand freezing against her collarbone. Declan took 2 steps closer to the witness chair. "Can you please direct my attention to the board minutes authorizing the Delta Vanguard collateral clause?" Jace blinked. His smirk faltered, replaced by a sudden rigid tension in his jaw. "The board was fully aware of the financial situation. We discussed the need for liquidity on several occasions." "That is not what I asked." Declan countered his tone, remaining terrifyingly polite. "I asked for the date of the formal vote. Did Charles Barbier cast a vote? Did Vivian Barbier cast a vote? I need you to point to the specific document authorizing the transfer of collateral." "We were operating under a condensed timeline," Jace stammered, his eyes darting toward his legal counsel. "The Texas firm demanded swift execution to lock in the interest rate. As executive director, I possess the authority to secure emergency funding to keep the freight schedules operational." Declan tilted his head, a predator analyzing a wounded target. "Emergency funding, yes. Pledging generational real estate without shareholder consent? No. Under Louisiana statute, encumbering corporate property without the requisite board approval constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty." "Objection," the opposing lawyer interrupted, raising a hand in a frantic attempt to break the momentum. "Counsel is badgering the witness and offering legal conclusions." The mediator frowned, peering over his spectacles. "The question stands. The witness will answer regarding the board vote." Declan leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the polished oak table, closing the physical distance between himself and my brother-in-law. The air in the room grew suffocatingly dense. "I am holding the corporate ledger from the 14th," Declan stated, his voice dropping to a surgical whisper. "There are no minutes recorded. There is no quorum established. I am going to ask you one final time, under penalty of perjury. Did you bypass the executive board and unilaterally leverage the Mississippi port leases to cover your own financial mismanagement?" The silence that followed was agonizing. Charles stared at Jace, a horrifying realization dawning in his eyes. The patriarch was finally seeing the parasite without the protective filter of family loyalty. The man he entrusted with his legacy was crumbling under cross-examination. Jace began to sweat. A single bead of moisture tracked down his temple, catching the harsh light from the windows. He looked at his lawyers, searching for a lifeline, but they offered nothing. They were drowning too. "I had to save the firm," Jace blurted out, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. "Charles was playing golf in Augusta. The local banks were calling in the loans. If I waited to convene a formal vote, we would have defaulted that week. Yes, I signed the collateral addendum on my own. I did what was necessary to keep the doors open." A collective gasp escaped my mother. Vivian pressed her hand over her mouth, her face draining of color until she looked like porcelain. Declan stepped back, buttoning his jacket once more. He did not smile. He did not gloat. The surgical strike was complete. "No further questions," Declan murmured, returning to his seat beside me. The admission hung in the room, a fatal, irrefutable confession of gross fiduciary negligence. Jace had just admitted on the record that he violated corporate bylaws to sign the contract. The Barbier legal strategy evaporated instantly. They could no longer claim bad faith on the part of Delta Vanguard when their own executive director had bypassed Louisiana law to execute the deal. The fraud originated from inside their own house. The opposing attorneys began frantically shuffling their papers, leaning in to whisper urgent, panicked advice into Jace's ear. But the damage was permanent. The mediator did not require a lengthy deliberation. He reviewed the transcript notes, adjusted his microphone, and delivered the ruling with swift, clinical detachment. "The petition for an emergency injunction is denied," the mediator announced, the gavel striking the sound block with a sharp, echoing crack. "The court finds no evidence of bad faith from the creditor. The debtor violated internal governance, which does not invalidate the lien. The foreclosure proceedings initiated by Delta Vanguard may proceed without further delay." Charles buried his face in his hands, a broken, hollow shell of the titan he used to be. Vivian stared blankly at the wall, her pristine reality shattering into dust. I stood up, gathering my purse. I did not offer a parting glance. Declan opened the heavy oak door, and we stepped out into the bright carpeted hallway of the mediation center. The victory tasted clean, devoid of any lingering guilt. But as we walked toward the elevators, the quiet was shattered by the frantic clicking of high heels. Camille came hurtling down the corridor. She had been waiting in a private holding room, shielded from the legal proceedings, expecting her husband and parents to emerge victorious. Instead, she had clearly intercepted a text message detailing the catastrophic ruling. She looked unhinged. Her designer trench coat hung open, her hair wild and disheveled from running. "You monster!" Camille shrieked, her voice bouncing off the marble walls. She threw herself in front of the elevator banks, physically blocking my path. Her face was flushed, contorted into a mask of pure, unbridled fury. Tears streamed down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. "You planned this just to ruin my life!" Camille screamed, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "You are a cold, vindictive sociopath. You stole our company because you could not handle the fact that my wedding was better than yours. You are destroying your own family over pure jealousy." People passing in the hallway stopped, turning to watch the spectacle. A junior clerk dropped a stack of files. The air grew thick with second-hand embarrassment. I stopped 3 feet away from her. I studied her face, searching for any trace of the sister I used to share secrets with when we were children. There was nothing left but a terrified, spoiled child realizing her infinite credit limit had just been canceled. She lacked the capacity to understand that her husband was the true architect of her downfall. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a defense. I let the silence stretch heavy and punishing until her shrieks dissolved into ragged, humiliating sobs. Declan reached out and pressed the call button for the elevator. A soft chime signaled the arriving car. The steel doors slid open. I stepped around my sister, my posture straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of ice. I walked right past her without uttering a single syllable. The doors closed on Camille collapsing against the marble wall. I had conquered the courtroom. The real estate was mine. But the cornered animal was still breathing, and the silence of my departure would push my sister into making a desperate, dirty move that crossed the line from civil dispute directly into criminal extortion. The silence following the mediation victory lasted less than 48 hours. Friday evening settled over our home with a heavy, unseasonable fog rolling off the river. I stood in the kitchen slicing a lemon for my tea, feeling the profound shift in the universe. The Barbier empire rested in my palms. The port real estate legally belonged to Delta Vanguard. Yet I knew the war possessed one final ugly skirmish. Cornered predators do not surrender. They bite blindly. The sharp chime of my phone broke the quiet. I wiped my hands on a towel and unlocked the screen. A text message from Camille illuminated the display. It contained no greeting. It consisted of a single audio file and a brief, threatening mandate. Drop the foreclosure by noon tomorrow, or I send this to every news outlet in Baton Rouge and the federal authorities. Meet me at Café Beignet on Royal Street at 10 in the morning. Come alone. I tapped the audio file, lifting the phone to my ear. I bypassed the security protocols my own voice echoed through, the speaker crisp and clear. I took down the mainframes. The entire digital infrastructure is compromised because I orchestrated the override. The recording stopped. I lowered the phone, staring at the screen. Camille had always wielded manipulation like a delicate instrument, twisting narratives at country club luncheons to secure her social standing. But this maneuver crossed a terrifying threshold. She had raided the corporate digital archives, hunting for any fragment of my voice she could weaponize. She found an old technical briefing from 2 years ago, a routine meeting where I explained a scheduled system update to the junior dispatchers. She took that innocent recording, chopped the sentences into fragments, and stitched them together to fabricate a confession of corporate cyber-sabotage. It was a blatant, desperate act of blackmail. She assumed I would panic. She believed the threat of federal investigation and public ruin would force me to capitulate and sign the port deeds back over to Charles. She truly thought she held the ultimate trump card. I did not panic. I felt a cold, calculating wave of finality wash over me. I took a sip of my tea, savoring the tart sting of the lemon. I opened a secure messaging channel and contacted Sloan. I instructed my phantom auditor to access the deep storage servers and retrieve the original, unedited Zoom recording of that specific technical briefing. Sloan delivered the file in less than 10 minutes. The next morning, the Louisiana humidity returned with a suffocating grip. I drove into the heart of the French Quarter, navigating the narrow streets lined with wrought iron balconies and hanging ferns. The air smelled of fried dough, powdered sugar, and the pungent tang of the river. A lone jazz saxophonist played a mournful tune on a street corner, the brass notes bouncing off the historic brick facades. I wore a tailored charcoal suit and a silk blouse. It was armor designed for the final execution of my family ties. I walked into the open-air courtyard of the cafe. Tourists bustled around the wrought iron tables, laughing over steaming mugs of chicory coffee. I spotted my sister, sitting in a secluded corner beneath the shade of a large magnolia tree. The contrast between the radiant bride at the gala and the woman sitting before me was staggering. Camille wore the same designer trench coat she had thrown over her shoulders at the mediation center, but today, the fabric possessed deep, chaotic wrinkles. Her posture, usually a masterclass in haughty elegance, slouched with profound exhaustion. Her blonde hair, normally blown out to perfection, sat pulled back in a severe, messy knot. Her manicure featured chipped edges. She looked like a hunted animal. I pulled out the metal chair across from her and sat down. The chair legs scraped loudly against the cobblestone patio. Camille did not order a coffee. She sat with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her knuckles stark white against her pale skin. "You received my message," Camille stated, her voice tight and brittle. I nodded, resting my hands on the scarred wooden tabletop. "I received your fabricated audio file. It must have taken you hours to splice those syllables together. Did Jace help you edit the recording, or is he too busy packing his Cayman Islands escape fund to assist in your extortion plot?" Camille flinched, her eyes darting nervously toward a passing waiter. She refused to acknowledge the truth about her husband. She clung to her denial with a terrifying grip. "The press will not care about the editing," Camille hissed, leaning forward. "The news cycle moves too fast for forensics. Once that audio hits the local stations, your professional reputation is ash. No private equity firm will ever do business with a known cybercriminal. You will face federal inquiries. The scandal will follow you for the rest of your life." She reached into the pocket of her trench coat. Her hand trembled as she withdrew a silver USB drive. She placed it on the table and slid it across the wood until it rested inches from my fingertips. "Sign the deeds back over to Charles," Camille demanded, attempting to summon a shred of her old authority. "Cancel the foreclosure proceedings immediately. Transfer Delta Vanguard back into the family trust. Do that, and I destroy this drive. You walk away with your freedom, and we walk away with our company." I looked at the silver drive. It sat there, a tiny monument to her sheer desperation and unfathomable ignorance. My sister had lived her entire life shielded by my parents' wealth, shielded from consequences, shielded from the harsh realities of the law. She believed the real world operated like a high school gossip circle. I did not reach for the drive. I reached into my blazer pocket and retrieved my own phone. I unlocked the screen, dialed the volume to the maximum setting, and pressed play on the file Sloan had sent me the night before. I bypassed the security protocols to install the new firewall update. My voice echoed from the phone speaker, ringing clear over the ambient noise of the cafe. I took down the mainframes for routine maintenance. The entire digital infrastructure is compromised if we do not migrate the data safely before the weekend. I paused the recording. The blood drained from Camille's face, leaving her complexion a ghostly, translucent white. Her mouth parted slightly, but no sound emerged. She stared at my phone as if it had transformed into a venomous snake. In American jurisprudence, blackmail requires two distinct elements, I explained. In American jurisprudence, blackmail requires two distinct elements, I explained, keeping my tone conversational and devoid of any malice. It requires a threat of exposure, and it requires a demand for property or financial gain. You provided both elements in writing via text message last night. You solidified your intent this morning by demanding $105 million in real estate in exchange for your silence. Camille swallowed hard, her throat working against a sudden severe drought. "Eden," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Extortion is a felony in the state of Louisiana," I continued, leaning closer to the table so she could hear every precise syllable. It carries a mandatory prison sentence. You cross the line from a civil dispute into a severe criminal offense. I tapped the screen of my phone, closing the audio player and opening a confirmed email receipt. I already forwarded your text message, the spliced audio file, and the original unedited recording directly to the district attorney, I stated, holding her gaze with unyielding intensity. The digital forensics team will verify the metadata by tomorrow. You tried to frame me for a crime. To steal a company your husband bankrupted. Tears welled in Camille's eyes, brimming over her lower lashes and carving wet paths down her cheeks. The arrogance finally shattered, revealing the profound, paralyzing terror beneath. She realized the shield of the Barbier name could not protect her from a felony indictment. Her parents' wealth was frozen. Her husband was a fraud. She possessed zero leverage and zero protection. "Please," Camille sobbed, reaching across the table to grasp my wrist. Her fingers felt like ice. "Please, Eden, retract the email. Do not send me to prison. I was just scared. We have no money left. The credit cards are declining. Jace will not speak to me. I did not know what else to do." I looked down at her hand clutching my sleeve. I felt a brief, fleeting pang of sorrow for the sister she could have been had she not allowed our parents to poison her soul with entitlement. But sorrow does not pay debts, and it does not reverse betrayal. I pulled my arm back, breaking her grip. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit. I looked down at the woman who had mocked my wedding day, the woman who had demanded I empty my savings to fund her luxury elopement, the woman who had just attempted to ruin my life. "Start packing your bags, Camille," I said, my voice carrying the quiet, devastating weight of finality. "The eviction notices for the corporate estate are being served tomorrow." I turned and walked out of the courtyard, leaving the USB drive sitting uselessly on the table. The jazz music faded behind me as I stepped back onto Royal Street. The final obstacle was neutralized. The criminal threat was dismantled. Only one task remained. I needed to walk into the Barbier Maritime boardroom, face Charles and Jace, and execute the final, undeniable transfer of power. The ghost they created was returning to collect the ultimate debt. The Louisiana sky tore open on Tuesday morning. A torrential downpour hammered the glass and steel facade of the logistics headquarters, sending thick sheets of gray water cascading down the floor-to-ceiling windows. The storm obscured the view of the muddy Mississippi River, wrapping the city in a dark, relentless deluge. I stood in the corporate lobby, listening to the sharp click of my heels against the polished concrete. 6 months ago, I walked out of these double doors, carrying a cardboard box stripped of my title, my equity, and my dignity. Today, I walked through them as the undisputed owner. Declan matched my stride, carrying a sleek leather briefcase containing the final settlement papers. The head of building security stood near the elevator banks. It was the exact same guard who had confiscated my key card and escorted me from the premises half a year prior. He recognized me instantly. He did not ask for a badge. He did not ask for my identification. He simply stepped aside, pressed the call button, and lowered his gaze to the floor in a silent acknowledgement of the new hierarchy. The steel doors parted, and our ascent to the 7th floor executive suite began in a quiet, rhythmic hum. My lead corporate counsel waited for us in the reception area. The transition meeting was legally mandated. My family possessed no remaining avenues for delay or appeal. They had no choice but to attend the formal surrender of their generational wealth. I drew a slow, fortifying breath and pushed open the frosted glass doors to the primary conference room. The air inside felt suffocatingly dense thick with the scent of stale coffee, expensive anxiety, and profound defeat. The ambient noise of the rain thrashing against the exterior glass provided a steady drumming soundtrack to their ruin. Charles sat at the head of the long oak table, but he looked like a ghost haunting his own life. The proud Southern patriarch who once commanded this room with a booming voice and unyielding authority, now stared blankly at the grain of the wood. His custom Italian suit hung loosely on his frame, the fabric bagging around his slumping shoulders. He looked fragile, his skin carrying a pale gray pallor that spoke of sleepless nights and shattered pride. Vivian sat rigid to his right. Her usual immaculate presentation showed severe, undeniable fractures. Her signature red lipstick was applied slightly uneven, and her hands rested flat on the table, the knuckles white with tension. She stared at a fixed point on the far wall, refusing to make eye contact with me, Declan, or the lawyers. Acknowledging my presence meant acknowledging her own irrelevance, and her fragile ego could not withstand the collision with reality. Camille occupied a chair near the far corner. The terror from our encounter in the French Quarter Café still clung to her features. She kept her head down, her shoulders curled inward, desperately, trying to shrink herself into the upholstery. She was a far cry from the radiant, vindictive bride who had gleefully toasted to my failure in front of 500 high society elites. The threat of a felony extortion charge had permanently silenced her cruel laughter. Then there was Jace. My brother-in-law sat across from Charles, adjusting the knot of his silk tie. Despite bankrupting the firm, forging corporate documents, and driving his new family into financial ruin, he still attempted to project an aura of unearned confidence. He believed this was a standard corporate restructuring. He operated under the delusion that he could smooth talk his way into a graceful exit, perhaps securing a consulting fee or a golden parachute to cushion his landing. His ignorance was truly a spectacle to behold. My lawyers stepped forward, breaking the heavy silence. They distributed the final binding agreements, sliding the crisp white packets across the dark mahogany table. The documents were comprehensive and merciless. They outlined the legal transfer of $105 million in commercial real estate operational control of the staging warehouses, the fleet manifests, and the port leases, entirely over to Delta Vanguard LLC. Charles stared down at the dotted line waiting at the bottom of the page. His hands trembled a faint rhythmic shake that he could not suppress. He reached blindly toward the center of the table, searching for a cheap plastic ballpoint pen provided by his defense counsel. I stepped forward, my shadow falling over his shoulder. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored navy blazer. My fingers closed around a piece of cool, heavy metal. When my auditors locked down the executive floor over the weekend to freeze the assets, I took a solitary tour of the empty offices. I walked into my father's suite and found his prized vintage gold fountain pen resting on his leather desk blotter. The heirloom he had unscrewed 6 months ago to sign away a decade of my grueling labor. I pocketed it for this exact moment. I withdrew my hand and placed the gold pen gently on top of the contract. The metal clicked softly against the wood, a sharp, defining sound that caused Charles to flinch. "Sign it," I commanded, my voice devoid of any anger or malice. It was the tone of inevitable gravity. Charles looked at the pen, recognizing the instrument of his own past cruelty. He slowly lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes meeting mine. He searched my face for any lingering trace of the compliant, desperate daughter who used to crave his approval. He found nothing but a reflection of his own ruthless corporate tactics, refined and turned back against him. A ragged, shuddering breath escaped his lips. He picked up the gold pen. He uncapped it with shaking fingers, pressed the nib to the heavy paper, and signed away his grandfather's empire. The ink flowed dark and rich, cementing the transfer of power. My lawyers swiftly collected the documents, checking the signatures, and placing them securely into their briefcases. The deed was done. The logistics hub, the river access, the digital infrastructure, everything belonged to me. Charles dropped the pen. It rolled across the table, coming to a stop near the edge. He did not speak. He simply closed his eyes and let his chin fall to his chest, a broken king mourning his lost kingdom. Jace cleared his throat, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. He offered a tight professional smile, attempting to pivot the energy in the room. "Well," Jace began, his tone dripping with misplaced corporate jargon, "it is clear a change in leadership was necessary to satisfy the creditors. I appreciate the swift resolution. Regarding my transition package, I assume we will route the severance details through my personal attorney. I am willing to offer 2 weeks of advisory support to ensure the freight schedules remain intact during the handover." I turned my attention to the slick social climber sitting across the table. I studied his tailored suit, his perfectly styled hair, and the arrogant curve of his mouth. I gestured to Declan, who reached down beside his chair and lifted a flat, unassembled piece of cardboard. With 3 swift motions, Declan folded the flaps, constructing a standard brown cardboard banker's box. The exact same kind of box I carried out of this building on the day I was fired. Declan slid the empty box across the polished oak table. It stopped directly in front of Jace, bumping gently against his water glass. "You do not have a transition package, Jace," I stated, my voice echoing off the glass walls of the boardroom. "You are terminated, effective immediately. Pack your desk. Security will escort you to the freight elevator in 10 minutes. Jace stared at the empty cardboard box, his professional facade cracking down the center. The patronizing smile vanished, replaced by a deep, ugly flush of indignation. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floorboards. "You cannot just fire me without cause," Jace spat, his voice rising in volume. "I am a contracted executive director. I have a legally binding employment agreement signed by the board. If you terminate me without a negotiated exit, I will sue this new holding company for breach of contract. I am entitled to a multi-million-dollar severance package, and I am not leaving this building until I see the wire transfer pending in my account." I looked at Jace, watching him puff up his chest and issue hollow threats. He thought he was intimidating a rival executive. He had no idea he was standing in the crosshairs of a forensic audit that had already dismantled his entire life. He demanded a multi-million-dollar severance, entirely oblivious to the fact that I held the banking logs to his hidden Cayman Islands offshore accounts. I offered a slow, chilling smile. I was going to give him a choice between working manual labor on my docks or spending the next decade in federal prison, and I was going to do it right in front of the family he destroyed. I let a short, genuine laugh escape my throat. The sound echoed off the polished oak paneling, bright and piercing in the suffocating room. Jace lifted his chin, mistaking my amusement for hesitation. He adjusted his silk tie, leaning back into his leather chair, waiting for me to offer a negotiation. He truly believed he held a winning hand. He assumed corporate buyouts always included a golden parachute for outgoing executives, regardless of their performance. I turned to Declan. He unlatched his leather briefcase with a sharp click, withdrawing a thick, red folder. He slid it across the table. It glided over the dark wood and stopped right against the edge of the empty cardboard box, waiting for Jace. "Open it," I instructed, my voice dropping to a cool, clinical tone. "Let us review your transition package." Jace offered a smug grin, pulling the folder open. I watched his eyes scan the top page. The grin faltered, his pupils dilated, the tan color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale chalk. His breathing hitched, suddenly shallow and erratic. He tried to quickly close the folder, his hands shaking, but the damage was already done. The truth was sitting on the table. "For the benefit of the room, I will read the highlights," I said, keeping my gaze locked on his terrified eyes. "Over the last 4 weeks, our new executive director authorized a series of complex wire transfers. He routed operational funds through 3 distinct shell corporations registered in Delaware. From there, the money flowed directly into a private numbered offshore bank account located in the Cayman Islands." Charles jerked upright in his chair. He stared at Jace, his jaw hanging loose. What is she talking about, Jace? I am talking about grand larceny, Charles, I clarified, never breaking eye contact with my brother-in-law. The man you trusted with your legacy was siphoning your remaining liquidity. He was bleeding the accounts dry to build a hidden escape fund. According to the internal emails my auditor recovered, he planned to secure the final wire transfer for a quiet divorce and flee the country by the end of the fiscal year. Camille gasped. The sound tore from her throat like a physical wound. She stared at the husband she had paraded around high society, the man she had used to humiliate me at her lavish reception. The illusion of her perfect marriage shattered into a million jagged fragments. "You were going to leave me?" Camille shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of the betrayal. "You were stealing my family, money, and leaving me behind." Jace could not speak. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The polished, slick social climber had vanished, replaced by a cornered thief staring at a locked door. He looked toward his defense attorneys, silently begging for a legal maneuver. But they sat perfectly still, refusing to touch a radioactive client. "You demanded a multi-million-dollar severance package," I stated, stepping closer to the edge of the table. "I am going to offer you a choice instead. You have two options regarding your exit from this building." I held up a single finger. Option 1. I hand this comprehensive dossier to the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in New Orleans this afternoon. Embezzling corporate funds across international borders constitutes severe wire fraud. You will face a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. You will trade your bespoke suits for a bright orange jumpsuit, and you will lose everything. I held up a second finger. Option 2. You sign a legally binding civil restitution and employment contract right now. You will report to Pier 4 at the Port of South Louisiana tomorrow morning at 4 o'clock. You will work as a minimum wage dockhand. You will wear a high-visibility vest, steel-toed boots, and a hard hat. You will haul heavy freight, secure cargo containers, and scrub the decks of my barges in the sweltering heat. Vanguard Maritime will garnish your wages until you repay every single cent you stole from this firm. The silence in the boardroom stretched tight and agonizing. Jace stared at the two fingers I held up, his mind racing to find a third option that did not exist. The arrogance had been thoroughly hollowed out of him. He was a fragile, terrified fraud, facing the catastrophic consequences of his own greed. He looked at the red folder, then at the hard, unforgiving lines of my face. The prospect of federal prison terrified him far more than physical labor. Prison meant losing his freedom, his comfort, and his carefully constructed identity. "I will sign the contract," Jace whispered, his voice trembling so badly the words barely formed. Declan withdrew a secondary document from his briefcase, pushing it across the table along with a basic plastic pen. Jace did not bother reading the clauses. He gripped the cheap plastic pen and scrawled his signature across the bottom of the page, legally sentencing himself to years of grueling manual labor on the very docks he had attempted to steal. "Security!" I called out, raising my voice to reach the hallway. Two broad-shouldered guards entered the room. "Escort our newest dock worker out of the building," I commanded. "Make sure he takes his cardboard box." Jay stood up on shaky legs. He did not look at Charles. He did not look at his weeping wife. He picked up his empty box and walked out of the boardroom, flanked by the guards. His head bowed in profound, crushing defeat. The empire was secured, the thief was chained to the hull, and the physical assets of the Mississippi Delta were safe. But the victory was only half complete. The corporate threat was neutralized, yet the social rot remained. I needed to extinguish the vicious smear campaign my mother and sister had orchestrated across Baton Rouge. I refused to engage in a petty online shouting match. I did not record defensive videos or post angry rebuttals. I chose a far more sophisticated battlefield. I reached out to the editor-in-chief of the Southern Maritime Executive Journal, the most respected and widely read business publication in the regional shipping industry. I offered them an exclusive, undeniable scoop regarding the hostile takeover and restructuring of the Barbier logistics empire. A week later, the monthly issue hit the mahogany desks of every Port Authority bank president and country club board member in the state. The cover featured a sleek, professional portrait of me standing in front of the New Orleans port, with a bold headline reading, "Vanguard Rising." Inside, the data-driven article laid bare the unvarnished truth. It did not rely on gossip or emotional manipulation. It utilized hard numbers, redacted wire logs, and court transcripts. The piece meticulously detailed Jace's gross fiduciary negligence, his attempted embezzlement, and his disastrous operational failures. More importantly, the article highlighted my strategic brilliance. It explained how Delta Vanguard quietly purchased the distressed debt to rescue the vital supply chain infrastructure from imminent bankruptcy. I was not painted as a jealous sister executing a cyber attack. I was presented as a visionary titan who saved a foundational industry from the hands of an incompetent predator. The truth acted as a devastating disinfectant. The social fallout was instantaneous and staggering. The Baton Rouge elites, who prioritize financial stability and competence above all else, read the forensic breakdown with widened eyes. The narrative shifted overnight. High society thrives on proximity to power, and they realized they had backed the wrong horse. When Vivian attempted to attend her weekly charity luncheon at the country club, she was met with icy, impenetrable silence. Women she had gossiped with for decades suddenly turned their backs, refusing to make eye contact. Her carefully curated image as the flawless matriarch shattered, exposing the toxic, enabling reality underneath. The invitations to exclusive galas stopped arriving. Her phone stopped ringing. Camille fared even worse. Her social media pages, once filled with fawning compliments and heart emojis, became ghost towns. The sycophants who praised her lavish Hawaiian elopement rapidly deleted their comments and distanced themselves from the scandal. They saw the truth in black and white print. Camille was not a victim of a cybercrime. She was the unwitting pawn of a con artist, complicit in the near destruction of her own family legacy. I watched the digital silence spread from the quiet sanctuary of my new corner office. The heavy burden I had carried for months finally evaporated, replaced by a clean, crisp sense of vindication. I had wielded the truth like a scalpel, cutting away the lies and exposing the infection to the sunlight. But the public exposure was only the catalyst. The profound financial shift was about to tear the remaining fabric of my toxic family entirely to shreds, leaving them to fight over the scraps of the illusion they had built. Money acts as the gravity holding toxic orbits together. Remove the capital, and the entire planetary system tears itself apart. Jace lost his executive salary, his limitless expense accounts, and his bespoke linen suits. Instead, he woke up at 3 a.m. in a dark, unfamiliar apartment to pull a stiff canvas uniform over his shoulders. He drove a rusted, sputtering sedan to Pier 4 long before the sun cleared the horizon. I received weekly performance logs from the dock foreman, a man Jace had previously attempted to fire for requesting basic safety upgrades. The irony was poetic and precise. Jace spent his grueling shifts hauling thick, grease-coated steel cables and scrubbing dark diesel stains off the concrete loading zones under the blistering, unforgiving Louisiana heat. The heavy chains tore deep blisters into his soft, manicured palms. Without the protective shield of stolen wealth, the true nature of his character surfaced. The slick charm dissolved into bitter, toxic resentment. He brought the distinct stench of river mud sweat and failure back to their luxury apartment every evening, carrying the undeniable physical proof of his profound incompetence. Camille possessed zero capacity for hardship. She had been groomed for leisure, raised from birth to believe financial struggle belonged strictly to a different tier of society. When the premium credit cards began declining at her preferred boutiques, the romantic facade of her Hawaiian elopement shattered into dangerous shards. The fairy tale required a limitless budget to survive the lack of genuine affection. When Jace could no longer finance her vanity, she turned on him with the terrifying ferocity of a starving animal. Their divorce proceedings erupted into a highly publicized, deeply humiliating spectacle that provided endless entertainment for the local tabloids. Court records became the primary source of country club gossip. They fought viciously over leased luxury vehicles, maxed out retail accounts, and the remaining scraps of their fleeting status. During a heated deposition, Camille tried to claim spousal support from a man whose meager wages were legally garnished by my company. The judge dismissed her request with a cold stare. She realized too late that she had bound herself to a sinking stone. The favorite golden child found herself drowning in legal fees and final eviction warnings stripped of the Barbier safety net. Charles and Vivian faced their own swift, punishing descent. Stripped of the logistics empire and the steady stream of high-yield corporate dividends they could no longer maintain, the sprawling Baton Rouge estate, the annual property taxes alone, exceeded their remaining pension income. They sold the grand mansion at a steep loss, just to avoid the humiliation of a bank foreclosure. The formidable Southern patriarch and the pristine socialite retreated into a modest, cramped condominium on the industrial outskirts of the city. The severe loss of square footage forced them to confront each other, stripped of the grand, formal dining rooms and manicured gardens they used to avoid genuine conversation. The new condo smelled of old carpet and stale air, a sharp contrast to the blooming jasmine they once enjoyed. Charles spent his days sitting in a cheap recliner, staring at a blank wall, a broken king in exile. The profound isolation drove my mother to a frantic state of madness. The silence from her elite social circle proved too heavy a burden for her fragile ego to bear. On a quiet Thursday evening, my phone illuminated on the kitchen counter. A single voicemail arrived from an unrecognized number. I pressed play, listening as I sliced fresh vegetables for dinner. Eden Vivian began her voice, brittle and laced with audible weeping. She sounded frantic. The polished, aristocratic tone was entirely replaced by raw, trembling desperation. "Please call me back. Your father is failing. The new condo is so small. We miss you." "You proved your point, darling, but family should stick together during hard times. We need to heal this rift." It was the exact same manipulative tactic she had utilized my entire life. She weaponized guilt, disguising her demand for a financial rescue as a plea for familial reconciliation. She did not apologize for stealing my equity. She did not acknowledge the cruel smear campaign. She simply wanted the key to the vault. I did not pause my knife. I sliced through a crisp green bell pepper, the rhythmic thud of the steel blade against the cutting board echoing in the peaceful kitchen. I listened to her feigned tears without feeling a single spark of anger or a hollow ache of loss. The emotional tether had dissolved. I tapped the screen, deleting the message before she even finished her sentence. I contacted my service provider and changed my phone number, severing the final digital thread connecting me to their orbit. The truest form of power is absolute indifference. A few weeks later, the ultimate testament to that power arrived in a secure digital folder. My private investigator, a former detective I kept on retainer to monitor the final legal transitions, sent me a single high-resolution photograph. I sat in my spacious office, opening the image on my wide monitor. The setting was unmistakable. A rain-slicked street deep in the French Quarter, far removed from the tourist-friendly jazz clubs and pristine antique shops. The frame captured a dingy, iron-barred storefront. A flickering neon sign cast a harsh, unforgiving red glow over the cracked, uneven pavement. It was a pawn shop, the kind of establishment that preys on desperation and ruined luck. Standing in the long line outside the reinforced glass door was Camille. The visual contrast struck me with breathtaking force. She wore a faded, wrinkled raincoat over a pair of simple dark leggings, her shoulders hunched tight against the damp river chill. Her immaculate blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, unwashed knot. She stared down at her open palm. Resting in the center of her hand was the blinding, ostentatious diamond ring Jace had purchased with stolen corporate funds. It was the exact same quail-egg diamond she had flashed at the dinner table the night they demanded I empty my life savings to fund her lavish reception. She was standing in the dark shadows of a predatory loan shop, preparing to barter the ultimate symbol of her hubris, just to make rent. The arrogant girl who deemed my intimate courtyard wedding trivial, the sister who mocked my consulting gig in front of 500 laughing elites, was now trading her pride for basic survival. I zoomed in on her face. The haughty, vindictive smirk was gone forever. Her features carried the hollow, sunken weight of a person who finally understands the true, devastating cost of their own arrogance. She betrayed a sister who would have moved mountains for her, all for a shallow fraud who left her standing in the rain. I closed the image folder, the screen returning to my desktop. I did not smile. I did not laugh or celebrate her misery. The poetic justice felt heavy and resolute, a quiet solemnity replacing the adrenaline of the corporate war. I looked down at my own left hand, tracing the simple, unadorned gold band Declan had placed on my finger during our quiet ceremony. My ring cost a fraction of the diamond Camille was currently pawning, yet it represented an unbreakable partnership built on truth and unyielding loyalty. The Barbier dynasty was reduced to ashes, scattered across minimum-wage docks and cramped condos. They traded their legacy for an illusion, and the illusion evaporated the moment the money stopped flowing. The old empire was dead. The final chapter required a total rebranding, an erasure of the toxic name, and the quiet establishment of a new legacy, built to endure the test of time. 1 year later, the skies over the Mississippi Delta stretched out in a brilliant, unbroken canvas of cobalt blue. The suffocating humidity that defined the previous summer had burned away, leaving a crisp, clear morning in its wake. I stood on the sprawling, wraparound balcony of my new corporate headquarters, a sleek structure of reinforced glass and dark steel rising high above the bustling port of New Orleans. The view below was a magnificent symphony of orchestrated, relentless movement. Towering cargo cranes pivoted with mechanical grace, hoisting heavy shipping containers onto waiting rail cars with pinpoint precision. Colossal barges navigated the winding, muddy current of the river, their engines providing a steady, distant hum that vibrated up through the soles of my shoes. It was the distinct sound of a well-oiled machine, a thriving logistics hub functioning at peak efficiency under my direct command. I leaned against the cool metal railing, letting the fresh, salt-tinged breeze off the Gulf of Mexico wash over my face. I remembered the torrential rain that hammered the country club windows on the night I delivered the default notice to Jace. I remembered the howling winds that tore at my front porch when Charles came begging for salvation. The severe storms had passed. The wreckage of my past was cleared. I stood in the bright sunlight, the undisputed architect of the calm that followed the tempest. The business had transformed remarkably under my leadership, shedding the bloated, inefficient practices of the past. Within 12 months, Vanguard Maritime tripled its financial valuation. We expanded our operational footprint, securing highly lucrative shipping routes that stretched from the Gulf Coast down into the deep-water ports of South America. The exponential growth was not fueled by empty bravado, slick charm, or flashy country club networking. It was driven by the proprietary software I coded in the quiet hours of the night, optimizing every single freight metric and cutting overhead costs by 30% across the board. But the most profound change was visual. I systematically erased the Barbier name from the maritime industry. The old, polished brass plaques were unscrewed from the warehouse doors and discarded. The faded, arrogant logos on our fleet of tugboats were painted over with a sharp, modern indigo crest. The legacy my father guarded with such toxic jealousy was dismantled, sold for scrap, and replaced by a brand built on merit, precision, and unyielding integrity. The old guard of the Louisiana shipping industry quickly learned that Vanguard Maritime did not operate on nepotism or inherited social standing. We operated strictly on results. The high society circles that once dictated the rules of engagement were rendered entirely irrelevant to my bottom line. I did not attend their lavish charity galas. I did not seek their superficial approval. I let the quarterly profit margins speak for themselves, a silent, undeniable testament to the quiet competence my family had tried so desperately to bury. The heavy glass door leading out to the balcony clicked open. Declan stepped onto the terrace, carrying 2 ceramic mugs. The rich, earthy scent of dark roast chicory coffee mingled perfectly with the river air. He wore a crisp white button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing the steady, capable strength in his forearms. He handed me a mug, his fingers brushing gently against mine. He stepped behind me, wrapping his free arm around my waist, pulling my back flush against his chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder, his dark eyes tracing the horizon along the sprawling port. We stood in comfortable silence, watching the freight ships glide across the water. His presence remained the anchor that kept me grounded through the extreme turbulence of the hostile takeover. We did not need to speak about the courtroom battles we had won, or the enemies we had vanquished. The undeniable proof was laid out before us in steel concrete and soaring profit margins. Declan shifted his hand, resting his palm flat against my lower abdomen. The gesture was tender, carrying a profound, unspoken gravity. We were expecting our first child in the spring. The realization of impending motherhood brought a fierce, protective clarity to my vision. I was not just building a corporate empire. I was constructing a fortress. This child would grow up surrounded by genuine affection, taught that respect is earned through strong character, not demanded through a wealthy surname. They would never experience the suffocating weight of conditional love. They would never learn to shrink themselves to appease a fragile parental ego or trade their dignity for a seat at a toxic dinner table. The vicious cycle of generational dysfunction ended the moment I walked out of that boardroom holding the deeds to the port. I had severed the infected roots, ensuring the new branches would grow strong, healthy, and free from the rot of the past. A junior executive, a brilliant young woman I hired fresh out of a prestigious supply chain management program, stepped onto the balcony. She held a thick leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She approached with a bright, confident stride, devoid of the fear and sycophancy that used to pollute the old offices under my father. She handed me a finalized contract for our next major acquisition, a strategic buyout of a regional freight forwarder that would solidify our dominance in the Gulf sector. I reviewed the terms, noting the flawless execution of the complex clauses we had outlined in our strategy meetings earlier that week. I did not reach for a vintage gold fountain pen to sign the crucial document. I pulled a standard, reliable black ink pen from my blazer pocket. I signed my name smoothly, the dark ink gliding across the page with definitive purpose and clear intent. I handed the portfolio back to the executive, offering a warm smile and a sincere word of praise for her meticulous research. She beamed, turning back toward the office to initiate the transaction. There was no grandstanding, there was no arrogant boasting, just the quiet, highly efficient execution of power. I looked back out over the muddy expanse of the Mississippi River, watching a white heron take flight against the clear blue sky. Reflecting on the agonizing, transformative journey of the past year, I realized the true, unvarnished nature of survival. I did not just survive their betrayal. I monetized it. My family tried to cast me as a pathetic footnote in their own fabricated story of success. They expected me to weep over the loss of their conditional approval, to beg for a scrap of validation, to drain my hard-earned life savings just to maintain proximity to their grand illusion. When they realized I would not comply with their demands, they tried to steal my life's work. But they failed to understand a fundamental, unshakable truth. You cannot steal the foundation from the person who poured the concrete. By choosing not to beg for my rightful seat at a broken, toxic family table, I saved up enough capital to buy the entire building, and I legally evicted them from the premises. True justice is rarely found in screaming matches, frantic social media posts, or bitter public arguments. The most devastating retaliation is a life lived exceptionally well, far beyond the reach of those who tried to break your spirit. It is about taking the heavy bricks they throw at you and using them to construct a fortress they can never enter. If you have ever felt erased by the people who were supposed to protect you, or if you have ever been told that your worth is tied solely to your blind compliance, hear this. You do not owe your silence to anyone. You do not owe your bright future to a poisoned legacy. You possess the inherent power to walk away, to build your own infrastructure, and to thrive in the warm sunlight on your own terms. Has a family member ever demanded your fierce loyalty while secretly undermining your success behind your back? Have you ever had to walk away from a highly toxic dynamic to protect your own peace and sanity? Share your personal story in the comments below. Let me know what state you are watching from today, and if this journey of reclaiming power resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comment section so I know you are out there. Do not forget to hit the subscribe button to join the Amanda Told Stories community. You will not want to miss the next story of resilience, boundary setting, and ultimate redemption. Your voice matters, and your peace is worth fighting for. Keep building your empire, one quiet victory at a time. There is a profound, quiet tragedy woven into the very fabric of the traditional American family. A tragedy that all too often masquerades as duty, legacy, and unconditional love. We are raised from infancy on the idealized imagery of the flawless Thanksgiving dinner, the sprawling suburban estate, and the absolute certainty that blood is thicker than water. In the American South, where Eden Barbier's story unfolds against the humid, complex backdrop of Louisiana, these traditional values are often amplified by an intense cultural emphasis on heritage and public reputation. Yet, as we trace the deep fractures in Eden's narrative, a darker reality emerges from beneath the polished veneer of high society. Her grueling journey from a discarded, overlooked daughter to the solitary, brilliant architect of a maritime logistics empire is not merely a thrilling tale of corporate vengeance. It is a devastating mirror held up to our deeply ingrained parenting values. It forces us to ask agonizing questions about what happens when a family prioritizes its manufactured public image over the genuine emotional safety of its own children. The complete collapse of the Barbier dynasty serves as a stark, unforgiving masterclass in the absolute necessity of honesty, fairness, and deep emotional awareness when raising the next generation. In American culture, we frequently equate family responsibility with financial provision and outward success. Parents like Charles and Vivian Barbier operate under the dangerous, pervasive delusion that writing a massive check, securing a prestigious country club membership, or passing down a lucrative family business absolves them of the intricate work of emotional parenting. They molded their two daughters not as autonomous human beings, but as utility players in the superficial theater of their own egos. Camille was meticulously groomed to be the beautiful socialite centerpiece, a delicate, expensive ornament designed to attract advantageous alliances. Eden, conversely, was systematically forged into the quiet, invisible workhorse. She was expected to carry the crushing weight of the family's logistical empire, to sacrifice her own milestones, and to do so without ever demanding a rightful seat at the head of the table. This is precisely where the traditional family structure rots from the inside out. When parents fail to distribute fairness, respect, and emotional awareness evenly among their children, they do not just cultivate standard sibling rivalry, they manufacture a psychological time bomb. True, authentic parenting requires the profound courage to look at your children and see them for exactly who they are, validating their inherent worth rather than measuring their utility to the family's brand. The long-term consequences of this parental blindness are most agonizingly visible in the spectacular downfall of Camille. It is incredibly tempting to view her simply as a vain, vindictive antagonist who received her rightful comeuppance. However, peeling back the layers of her toxic entitlement reveals a deeply insecure child systematically failed by the very people who claimed to adore her. By constantly shielding Camille from the natural educational consequences of her actions, and by secretly funding her extravagant elopement while entirely disregarding the sanctity of Eden's wedding, Charles and Vivian committed a profound act of parental negligence. They tragically confused indulgence with love. In their unending bid to maintain a flawless societal facade, they stripped Camille of the critical opportunity to develop genuine resilience, personal accountability, and a moral compass. When the stolen corporate wealth inevitably evaporated, Camille was left standing in the freezing rain outside a French Quarter pawn shop, unequipped to navigate the brutal realities of the world. Honesty is the non-negotiable anchor of any healthy family structure. When parents lie to their children about their own flaws or habitually cover up a golden child's failures just to keep the peace, they build a towering mansion on a foundation of quicksand. Effective long-term guidance requires the heartbreaking discipline of letting your children fall and feel the crushing weight of their own mistakes. We are relentlessly conditioned by our society to believe that familial loyalty is an unbreakable covenant that must be preserved at all costs. We are taught to forgive endlessly, to turn the other cheek, and to continuously shrink our boundaries to comfortably accommodate the dysfunction of our bloodline. But Eden's story challenges this ingrained American dogma with surgical precision. Her ultimate triumph was not the calculated acquisition of $105 million in port real estate. Her true victory was the radical, terrifying decision to stop waiting for a familial rescue that was never coming. She recognized that remaining in a toxic environment for the sake of tradition is the ultimate betrayal of the self. As she stands on her corporate balcony preparing to welcome her own child with Declan, Eden is actively rewriting the genetic code of her lineage. She is ensuring that her child will never know the suffocating weight of conditional love. She is proving that true family responsibility sometimes means possessing the strength to burn the decaying ancestral home to the ground, strictly so that you can plant a new thriving garden in the nutrient-rich ashes. Stories like Eden's are exceedingly rare because they require us to confront the deeply uncomfortable truths hiding within the walls of our own living rooms. They ask us to examine the quiet, bitter resentments we swallow to keep the peace, and the essential boundaries we sacrifice in the name of blood loyalty. If this reflection resonates with the silent, exhausting battles you have fought behind closed doors, or if you are currently in the arduous process of reclaiming your own voice from the dark shadows of conditional love, I warmly invite you to subscribe and follow Amanda Told Stories. Join our growing community of listeners who believe that the most powerful, transformative narratives are the ones that challenge our social conditioning, validate our unspoken pain, and remind us that we possess the ultimate strength to write our own definitive endings. As we navigate the intensely complex, often treacherous waters of modern family dynamics, we must ultimately confront the exact nature of the legacy we are leaving behind for the next generation. Conventional wisdom firmly dictates that endless forgiveness is the ultimate virtue of a good family, that keeping the unit intact is the highest moral achievement a person can attain, regardless of the devastating cost to one's own soul. But perhaps that is the greatest, most destructive lie we have ever been sold by American culture. Perhaps the most profound, deeply protective act of love you can offer the next generation is the absolute, unyielding refusal to forgive those who refuse to change. The truest form of parenting is not found in desperately preserving the illusion of a perfect bloodline, but in possessing the ruthless, terrifying clarity to sever it completely when it becomes a poison. We spend our entire lives utterly terrified of breaking the branches of our family tree, completely unaware that the roots were dead and rotting long before we were even born. You are left to wonder, as you sit quietly and look around your own dinner table tonight, are you proudly maintaining a beautiful tradition? Or are you just serving a life sentence in a gilded prison you inherited?